There is a kind of knowledge that lives below memory, older than anything you were taught in school or read in a book or heard from someone who loved you. A knowledge that exists in the body rather than the mind, in the particular stillness that comes over you when you stand at the edge of something vast and feel, without being able to explain why you feel it, that you have been here before, not in this life perhaps, not in any life you could name or locate in ordinary time, but somewhere in the long story of what you are, something ancient stirs at the sound of certain words, at the light of certain images, at the particular quality of silence that falls when a very old story begins to be told. You are approaching that kind of knowledge now. Settle into the quiet. Let the world outside this moment recede to its proper distance. What follows is not a story about creatures in a book. It is a story about the oldest witnesses to existence itself, the ones who opened their eyes when the world was still learning what it was, who walked through ages so remote that the mountains which seem ancient to us were, to them, still young. The elves were here before almost everything. This is where we begin. The story of the elves cannot properly begin with the elves themselves, because the elves, like everything that exists within the world that Tolkien called Arda, did not simply appear out of nothing one morning when the conditions happened to be right. They were imagined before they were made, they were loved before they were born. And the imagining of them, and the loving of them, happened in a place and in a mode of being so far removed from anything that ordinary experience can directly access, that approaching it requires a particular kind of patience, a willingness to let the mind move into registers of thought that daily life does not usually require of it, to think about time and creation and intention in ways that feel less like analysis and more like listening. The story of the elves begins with music, which is perhaps the most honest possible beginning, because music is the form of human experience most capable of carrying the weight of things that have no other adequate container, things like longing and the foreknowledge of loss, and the particular beauty of something that was made with full awareness that it would not last forever. In the beginning, before Arda existed, before any physical thing existed at all, there was Iluvatar, whom the elves would later call Eru, the One, the single originating consciousness from whom all of creation would ultimately proceed. Iluvatar did not make the world alone and in silence, the way a craftsman might work in a quiet room with only their tools for company. Instead, Iluvatar made music, or rather, Iluvatar invited music, gathering around himself the great spirits he had first brought into being, the Ainur, the Holy Ones, and proposing to them a theme, a single originating melody, the first thing that had ever been proposed in a universe that had not yet learned the difference between what exists and what might exist. The Ainur took up the theme and began to sing, and what they sang was, in the understanding that the oldest elvish traditions preserve, not merely sound, but the blueprint of everything that would ever be, the world and everything in it encoded in the relationships between notes, between voices, between the places where one melody yielded to another, and the places where two melodies met and produced something that neither had contained alone. It was, by all the accounts that the elvish scholars who later devoted themselves to understanding it were able to reconstruct, an experience of almost incomprehensible beauty, a music so vast and so intricate and so perfectly expressive of its source that even the most powerful of the Ainur, who were themselves beings of immense intelligence and perception, were moved by it in ways they had never been moved before and would never quite be moved again in exactly the same way. There is a quality of feeling that belongs specifically to the moment when you encounter something that exceeds your capacity to fully comprehend it, but that you understand in the same instant to be true, not true in the limited sense of factually accurate, but true in the deeper sense of being precisely what it is, of being fully itself in a way that nothing diminished or compromised or approximated could ever be. That quality was present in the great music, present in such concentrated form that it constituted a kind of atmosphere, a condition of the space in which the Ainur sang, and those who experienced it were changed by it in ways that they would spend the rest of their very long existences trying to understand. But Melkor was among the Ainur, and Melkor, who had been given by Iluvatar the greatest gifts of power and knowledge among all the Ainur, was also the one who had spent the longest time moving alone through the void, searching for the secret fire of Iluvatar, the flame of creation that he wished to possess for himself, to use for his own purposes rather than in service of the larger design. What Melkor brought to the great music when the singing began was not precisely malice in the fully formed sense that malice would eventually take on in the long history of the world. It was something more like impatience, the impatience of an enormously gifted mind that has decided it understands the destination better than the guide, and that the most direct route to beauty is through the assertion of individual will rather than through the discipline of shared intention. He began to weave into the music themes of his own devising, themes that departed from the original melody in ways that were, considered in isolation, sometimes genuinely impressive, reflecting as they did the full force of his considerable gifts, but that clashed with the themes around them and produced, in the places where his voice met the voices of the other Ainur, a discord that spread outward from those points of collision like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The discord troubled the Ainur around him. Some faltered and fell silent, uncertain how to respond to something so unexpected and so contrary to the spirit of what they had understood themselves to be doing. Others tried to accommodate it, bending their own themes to work around it, producing in the process a music that was more complicated and more strained than what they had originally intended, beautiful in places and painful in others, and everywhere marked by the effort required to hold it together against the disruptive force that Melkor was introducing. And Iluvatar watched and listened and did something that would prove to be one of the most important and most quietly devastating acts in the entire history of creation, which is to say that Iluvatar responded to Melkor's discord not by silencing it, but by incorporating it, weaving the disruption itself into a deeper pattern, one so vast that it encompassed the discord without being destroyed by it, using what had been introduced as a kind of rebellion against the design as material for a design more complex and more sorrowful, and more ultimately true than the original could have been without it. This happened 3 times. Melkor introduced his discordant themes, and the music was troubled, and Iluvatar deepened the pattern to contain it, and with each cycle the music grew more complicated and more moving, and more marked by the texture of conflict and resolution, and what it described in its final form was not the simple paradise that the earliest and most uncomplicated version of the theme might have expressed, but something richer and darker and more completely expressive of the full range of what existence actually contains, a world with shadow in it as well as light, with grief as well as joy, with the particular depth of feeling that can only exist in a consciousness that knows what it is to lose something it has loved. When Iluvatar finally brought the music to its close, the Ainur sat in silence for a long time, in the way that people sit in silence after music that has moved them past the point where words feel adequate to what they have heard. And then Iluvatar showed them what they had sung. He spoke a word, and the vision of the world appeared before them, not yet real but fully present in the mode of vision, complete in every detail. Every mountain and river and forest and plain laid out across the darkness of the void with a clarity that made it feel more real than anything the Ainur had encountered before, because it was, in some sense, they could not fully articulate, already true, already actual, already possessed of its own irreversible reality, even though it had not yet been made physical, even though the word that would translate it from vision into matter had not yet been spoken. They looked at what they had made together, and they understood for the first time what the music had been describing, and some of them were filled with a desire so intense it was almost painful, a desire to enter into the vision, to become part of the world they had sung into existence, to be present in it and to participate in its unfolding rather than to remain outside it as its architects and observers. Among everything they saw in that vision, among the mountains and the seas and the slow movement of the light across the long ages that were yet to come, there was one theme that many of the Ainur found themselves returning to, a thread of melody that ran through the music from near its beginning to near its end, so delicate that it was easy to miss and so persistent that once noticed it was impossible to ignore, a theme of such fragile and particular loveliness that some of the Ainur who perceived it found their eyes filled with something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but occupied the exact place where the two meet, in the territory of feeling that has no clean name because it belongs to the experience of things that are beautiful specifically because they will not last, that carry their transience inside them as a quality rather than a deficiency, that are more completely and more achingly themselves because the moment of their existence is bordered on all sides by the dark. This theme was the theme of the children of Iluvatar. This theme was, though the Ainur did not yet know it in these terms, the theme of the elves. And everything that they would become, Every grief and every glory and every act of devastating beauty and devastating ruin that the long history of the Elvish people would contain was already present in it, encoded in the relationships between notes, waiting in the music for the moment when the world would be real enough to receive them. The vision passed, and the word was spoken, and the world became real. Not all at once, and not without effort, and not without the same conflict that had marked the music from which it had been drawn, because the world that Iluvatar made actual was the world that the music had described in its full complexity, shadow and light together. Grief woven into the fabric of things from the very beginning, inseparable from the beauty that accompanied it, the way night is inseparable from the stars it makes visible. The Aina who had desired most deeply to enter into the vision were given leave to do so, descending into the world in a diminished form, binding themselves to it and its history in a commitment so total that they would remain part of it until its ending. No longer the vast unconstrained presences they had been in the void, but something smaller and more particular and more capable, by virtue of that particularity, of genuine relationship with the things that lived and moved and changed within the world they had chosen to inhabit. These were the Valar and the Maya, the powers of the world, who would shape its physical form across the long ages before the children of Iluvatar awoke, raising mountains and carving valleys and filling the great basins of the earth with water, preparing, though they did not always know it in these explicit terms, a dwelling place for the beings whose theme had moved so many of them to something close, to tears in the moment of the music's ending. That preparation took ages beyond the reckoning of any clock that the later world would devise, ages during which the world was made and made again, as the Valar shaped it, and Melkor, who had also entered into it, and who was also bound to it, and whose immense gifts were turned entirely toward destruction and domination rather than making, broke what they built and darkened what they illuminated and poisoned what they caused to grow. The two lamps were raised and then destroyed. The first great flowering of Middle-earth, the Spring of Arda, was ended by Melkor's violence before any living thing with a mind had come to witness it. The Valar withdrew to the far west, to the continent they called Aman, where they raised the two trees of Valinor and created from their mingled light a new illumination, silver and gold, that fell upon the blessed realm and made it the most beautiful place in the world, and did not reach, except in the faintest and most attenuated form, the vast darkness of Middle-earth to the east, which lay under the stars alone, cold and enormous and largely unmoved by the great events that were slowly preparing it to receive its most important inhabitants. It was in this darkness, in this age of stars, that the elves awoke. The place was a shore, the shore of an inland sea called Cuiviénen, which means in the oldest elvish tongue the water of awakening, a name that was not given to it by anyone other than the elves themselves, who named it in the first days of their consciousness from the simple fact of what had happened there, the way that people name places after the most significant thing that occurred in them, so that the name becomes a permanent record of the moment, a marker set in language to hold the memory of an experience that preceded the full development of the tools needed to record experience at all. The sea was cold and still and very deep, lying in a wide basin in the far east of Middle-earth, surrounded by forests of a darkness so complete and so old that the trees themselves seemed to have incorporated the absence of light into their substance, their bark the colour of deep water, their canopies so dense that the starlight which fell upon them from above was absorbed rather than reflected, so that the forests around Cuiviénen gave back nothing to the sky, and the sky gave nothing to the forests, and between them they maintained the most profound darkness that the world contained. A darkness that was not threatening in the way that later ages would teach people to find darkness threatening, but simply primary, the original condition of things, the ground state from which all subsequent variation would depart. And in that darkness, on that shore, with the cold water of Cuiviénen before them, and the ancient forest behind them, and the stars above them, in a sky that had never been anything other than stars, the elves opened their eyes for the first time. The oldest accounts, preserved in fragments of such antiquity that even the elvish scholars of the later ages could not determine with certainty when they had first been committed to a form capable of transmission, describe this moment with a care and a reverence that suggests it remained, for all the long history of the elvish people across all the ages that followed, the most sacred and the most tenderly held of all their collective memories, not the great battles, not the moments of highest art or deepest grief, or most exquisite beauty that their long history would produce in such abundance: the moment of waking. The first opening of eyes in a world that had been waiting across ages of preparation for exactly this. What those first eyes saw in the moment of their opening was starlight on water. This is a fact of such apparent simplicity that it is easy to pass over it without pausing to consider what it meant, what it actually gave to minds that had never seen anything before, and that were therefore receiving not merely a visual impression, but an entire conceptual framework, an initial understanding of what the world was and what seeing was, and what it felt like to be a consciousness, located in a body in a specific place at a specific moment in time. The stars of the age before the sun and moon were brighter than they would later become. Because Vada, the Lady of the Stars, had kindled them with particular intensity in the ages before the children awoke, and they fell on the surface of Cuivienen with a clarity and a multiplicity that transformed the water into something that seemed to contain the sky within itself, a second sky looking up at the first, each reflecting the other in an exchange of light so quiet and so perfect that the first elvish minds, receiving it as their initial experience of existence, understood beauty before they understood almost anything else about the world or about themselves. The 68 who awoke first are named in the oldest traditions, though the names themselves have come down through so many layers of transmission and translation that scholars debate their precise original forms. There were 3 pairs among the first to wake, from whom the 3 great kindreds of the elves would eventually be reckoned. 3 couples who found each other in the darkness before they had fully understood what finding or what each other meant, drawn together by something that the later elvish tradition would describe as the recognition of a kindred nature, the particular quality of attention that occurs between beings who are, at some deep level of their constitution, made for one another's company. Emin and his companion, Tada and his companion, Inel and his companion. These are the names the tradition preserves, the first names in the history of a people who would prove, across all the ages of their existence, to be among the greatest namers the world had ever produced. A people for whom language was not merely a tool for communicating information, but an act of genuine creation, a way of making the world more fully real by giving its components their proper designations, and thereby establishing the relationships between things that make a world rather than simply an accumulation of separate phenomena. Around these 3 original pairs were 62 others, waking in 1s and 2s along the shore of Cuivienen, each one opening their eyes onto the same starlit water, and the same ancient darkness, and the same cold air carrying the smell of deep forest, and the particular mineral clarity of a body of water that has been undisturbed for ages beyond counting. They did not know, in those first moments, that they were the first of their kind. They did not know that there were others of their kind, that the figures they could see moving at the edge of their vision in the starlight were beings like themselves, rather than simply features of a world whose total contents they had not yet had the opportunity to survey. They didn't know what anything was, including themselves, including the fact of knowing. What they had, in those first moments, was perception without interpretation, experience without framework, the pure, unmediated encounter with existence that is perhaps the most profound and most unrepeatable thing that a conscious being can undergo, and that the elves underwent collectively in starlight, on the shore of a cold inland sea, in the darkness before the first sunrise. The tradition records that the first elvish utterances were not words but sounds, and that those sounds were responses to the world rather than descriptions of it, exclamations drawn out of new minds by the overwhelming quality of the experience of being, sounds of wonder, and of something that was not yet refined enough in its emotional character to be called joy, but that occupied the same territory, the territory of feeling that belongs to the encounter with something so much larger and so much more beautiful than anything that could have been anticipated, that the only possible response is a sound from somewhere below the level of articulate thought. And then, in the hours and days that followed, as the 68 began to understand what they were to each other and to build, from the raw material of their perceptions and their new relationships, and the inexhaustible strangeness of the world around them, something that functioned as a community and a language and a culture. The sounds became words, and the words became the first language, the language that the elvish tradition calls Quendrin or primitive Quendian, the root tongue from which all the later languages of the elves would grow, the oldest linguistic structure in the history of Middle-earth, developed on the shore of Cuiviénen in the Age of Stars by people who had been alive for less than a generation, and who were already, with the particular urgency that would characterize their kind across all the ages to come, making something beautiful from the raw material of their experience. The first Elvish word for the stars was a word that meant, in its most literal translation, those that kindle the water, a compound that preserved within its structure the precise quality of that original experience, the starlight on Cuiviénen, the sky and the water, the moment of waking into beauty. That this word survived in recognizable form across thousands of years of linguistic change, preserved in the later Elvish tongues with its etymology intact and its connection to Cuiviénen explicitly remembered, tells us something important about the Elvish relationship to their own origins, about the intensity of the care with which they held the memory of that first night and passed it forward through the generations, not as a fact to be recorded but as an experience to be transmitted, a gift given to every elf born in later ages, who would never stand on the shore of Cuiviénen themselves, but who could, through the living structure of the language they had inherited, understand something of what it had felt like to open their eyes for the first time in a world that was wholly new and wholly beautiful, and wholly, in that first moment, untroubled by the shadow that was already, in the forests beyond the shore, beginning to move toward them. For they were not alone on the shore of Cuiviénen, though it would be some time before they understood this in its full significance. The world around them was not empty, had never been empty, and the darkness of the forest that ringed the inland sea was not simply the natural darkness of ancient trees, but something that also contained, in the ages just before and just after the Elvish awakening, presences that were not Elvish and not Valar and not the neutral wilderness that the world's unmade spaces might have been if the history of those early ages had proceeded differently. Melkor was in the world, had always been in the world since the moment the Ainur descended, and his attention, once the elves awoke, would turn toward them with a focus and a hunger that would become the first great darkness in their history, the shadow that fell across the shore of Cuiviénen before the Valar even knew the children of Ilúvatar had opened their eyes. But that shadow belongs to the next movement of this story, and this moment, the moment of waking itself, deserves to rest a little longer in the stillness of the starlight before the darkness is allowed to enter it, because there is something in the image of those first elves on the shore of Cuiviénen, something in the picture of 68 newly conscious beings sitting beside a cold inland sea in the Age of Stars, speaking their first words to each other in a language they were inventing as they went, looking up at the sky and finding it so full of light that they named their entire world by it, that asked to be held for its own sake, not as a prelude to what followed, but as a thing complete in itself, a moment of such concentrated original beauty that the grief and the grandeur and the loss that would fill all the ages to come cannot diminish it, can only deepen it, the way the knowledge of winter deepens the particular quality of attention we bring to the last warm evening of the year. The elves were here, the stars were burning, the water was still, and for a little while, in the darkness before the sun, the world was exactly what it was, and what it was enough. The stillness did not last, because stillness in a world that contains Melkor cannot last, and the elves on the shore of Cuiviénen were not yet old enough or experienced enough to understand that the darkness around them was not simply the neutral darkness of an unlit world, but something that had been shaped over ages of deliberate effort into a medium of concealment and predation, a darkness that watched and remembered and was, in the period of the Elvish awakening, watching and remembering with a particular and focused intensity that the newly conscious beings beside the water had no framework yet for recognizing or for naming. They had named the stars. They had begun to name each other. They were still in the process of naming the world, still in the first extraordinary work of building a language adequate to the experience of existence. And the thing that moved in the forest beyond the shore was not something that their new and beautiful language had yet found a word for, because it was not something that the experience of beauty and starlight and cold water and the warmth of new companionship had prepared them to anticipate or to conceptualize. The shadow was real before they had a word for shadow. The danger was present before they had a concept of danger. This is perhaps the most ancient and most terrible form of vulnerability that any conscious being can experience, and the elves of Cuiviénen experienced it in the first age of their existence. before they had built the emotional and conceptual architecture that later ages would give their descendants for understanding what had happened to them there. Melkor knew about the elves before the Valar did. This is one of the most significant and most carefully considered facts in all of Elvish history, and its significance compounds rather than diminishes with reflection, because what it means is that the first relationship the Elvish people had with a power greater than themselves was not the relationship of beloved children encountering benevolent guardians, not the warm and reciprocal recognition that the Valar would eventually bring to their meeting with the firstborn, but something almost precisely opposite, something cold and acquisitive and entirely unconcerned with the welfare or the flourishing or the continued existence of the beings it had turned its attention toward. Melkor found the elves because he was already in the east of Middle-earth, already moving through the darkness with the purposeful attention of a power that had spent ages learning the geography of every region the Valar had not yet fully claimed, and because the awakening of conscious beings in the world produced a kind of disturbance in the fabric of things. A new quality of presence that someone sufficiently attentive and sufficiently motivated to notice such things could not fail to perceive. He perceived it. He turned toward it. And in the time between his first awareness of the elves and the Valar's first awareness of them, a time whose precise length the tradition does not record but which may be understood as the period during which the elves were most completely alone and most completely without protection, he began the work that would cast the longest and the darkest shadow over all of Elvish history. The elves of Cuiviénen in those early days did not range far from the shore. The inland sea was the centre of their world, the place they had woken into, and the place that provided the water and the fish and the particular quality of openness, the sky visible, the stars reflected, that had come to feel, in the short time of their new existence, like home in the most fundamental sense that the word can carry, the sense of the place that is most itself, and that therefore allows you to be most yourself when you are in it. The forests around the sea were darker and denser and less familiar than the shore, and the elves entered them cautiously in the early days, not from a fear they could have articulated, but from something more instinctive and less conscious, a reluctance to leave the light of the water and the open sky for the absolute darkness beneath the canopy, where the starlight did not penetrate, and the sounds were the sounds of old deep places that had never been disturbed by anything that thought, or spoke, or sang. They went in pairs when they went at all, and they did not go far, and they returned to the shore with something that was not yet relief, but that occupied the same part of their developing emotional vocabulary, something like the particular quality of ease that comes from returning to a place that is known after a period spent in a place that is not. It was from the forest that the disappearances came. The tradition is careful and deliberate in the way it describes this. Careful in the way that very old accounts of very terrible things are often careful, using language that is precise without being graphic, that acknowledges what happened without performing it, that understands that the weight of an event like this is carried more effectively by restraint than by elaboration. What the accounts say is simply that elves began to go missing. Not all at once, and not dramatically, and not in ways that immediately announce themselves as the deliberate action of an external agency rather than the ordinary hazards of an unmapped and largely unknown world. One elf who had gone into the forest to explore did not return, then another, then a pair who had gone together and from whom the shore received no signal and heard no sound, not even the sound of alarm or distress that would have told those waiting that something had happened, only silence. The particular silence that is more troubling than any noise because it offers nothing to work with, no information about what to prepare for or how to respond. The elves did not yet have the full vocabulary for what they were feeling in those early days of the disappearances, but they had enough of a vocabulary to recognize that what they were experiencing was something new and something that the beauty of the stars on the water had not prepared them for, a feeling that lived in the body rather than the mind, that made the darkness at the edge of the firelight feel different than it had felt before, denser and more purposeful, full of a quality of attention that was not the neutral attention of an environment going about its own processes, but something more directed and more interested and more specifically oriented toward them. Melkor did not come himself in those early predations on the shore of Cuiviénen. He sent servants, shadows and hunters whose names the tradition does not preserve because they were never known, beings shaped from darkness and will and the particular quality of malice that Melkor had developed over ages of solitary movement through the void, beings whose gifts were concealment and patience, and the capacity to move through the world without announcing themselves, to be present in a place without altering the quality of the air in that place enough to alert the sensitive minds of the beings they were hunting. They came at the margins, at the edges of the firelight, when the attention of the elves on the shore was directed elsewhere, when someone had wandered a little further from the group than usual, when the darkness at the forest's edge was at its thickest and the stars at their most distracting, drawing the eyes upward at the very moment when the danger was coming from below, from the shadows at ground level, from the spaces between the trees where the light did not reach, and where something that was not wind was moving with great care and great purpose through the undergrowth. The elves who were taken were not killed immediately. This is the fact that the oldest accounts approach most obliquely and most carefully, the fact that requires the most gentleness in the telling, because it is the fact that carries the most lasting weight in elvish history, the fact that is both ancient and permanently unresolved. That echoes forward through all the ages that followed in ways that never quite stopped resonating. The elves who were taken were brought to Melkor, and in Melkor's keeping they were subjected to something that the tradition describes with a consistent and telling vagueness, a vagueness that is not the vagueness of ignorance, but the vagueness of knowing something that resists direct articulation, that can be gestured toward but not fully named, because the thing it describes is a process of such fundamental violence to the nature of conscious being that the full vocabulary of elvish thought, which was eventually the most sophisticated and most expressive of all the languages of Middle-earth, never quite developed the words to describe it from the inside, from the perspective of those who had undergone it. What Melkor did was take elvish minds and elvish bodies, which were at that point the newest and most beautiful things in the world, things fresh from the intention of Ilúvatar and still carrying in their substance something of the quality of that original loving attention, and he twisted them. The word the tradition uses is a translation from a root that carries the sense of bending something past its tolerance, of applying force to a material in a direction it was not designed to bear until the material changes its essential character, until what it was before the force was applied is no longer accessible, no longer recoverable, overwritten by what the force has made it into. He took minds capable of wonder and language and the perception of beauty, and he applied to them, over time and through means that the tradition declines to specify, a pressure so sustained and so precisely directed that those minds were remade into something that retained the shape of consciousness, retained the capacity for perception and response, and even a kind of thought, but that had been evacuated of everything that had made those capacities valuable, everything warm and curious and capable of love, everything that had looked up at the stars on the water at Cuiviénen and made a sound of pure astonished joy. What emerged from this process was, in the understanding of the elvish tradition that eventually named and tried to comprehend it, the first orcs, not a separate creation, not beings that had been made from nothing by Melkor's power, because Melkor had no power to create life from nothing, that power being Ilúvatar's alone and entirely uncommunicated to any of the Ainur. The first orcs were elves, and in some deep structural sense that the most serious elvish philosophical traditions spent ages debating without fully resolving, remained elves, remained firstborn, carried within their corrupted substance the original nature that had been applied to them in the darkness of the Age of Stars, buried so far beneath the layers of what Melkor had made them into, that it could not be reached or expressed or recovered, but present nonetheless, the way the memory of a living form persists in something fossilized. The original shape preserved even as the original substance has been entirely replaced by something else. The elvish scholars who meditated most deeply on this question, in the later ages when there was enough distance from the original event to approach it, with something approaching philosophical equanimity, concluded with a sorrow that was never entirely academic that Melkor had not made the orcs. He had unmade elves and left orcs where the elves had been, which was a different kind of act and a worse one, because making implies at least the neutral act of bringing something new into existence, while what Melkor had done implied the active destruction of something that had already existed and that had been, before his attention fell upon it, entirely itself. The Valar did not know this had happened for a long time. The east of Middle-earth in the Age of Stars was remote from a man, remote from the light of the two trees, and the deliberate concern of the powers who had withdrawn to the western continent, and were, in the period of the Elvish Awakening, engaged in the long work of making Valinor into the most beautiful and the most protected place in the world. They were not indifferent to Middle-earth, and they were not indifferent to the children of Ilúvatar, whose coming they had been told to expect and whose existence they anticipated, with something that the tradition describes as a mixture of reverence and longing, a desire to meet beings whose theme in the great music had moved them so deeply. But the world was vast, and the east was dark, and the particular kind of attention that would have allowed them to perceive the awakening of the elves and the simultaneous predations of Melkor's servants on the shore of Cuiviénen required a directedness of focus that was difficult to maintain across the distances involved, especially when there was, until the elves began to disappear and the survivors began to develop enough of a framework for what was happening to generate something that could be perceived as distress rather than simply as the background noise of a world going about its processes. It was Orome who found them, in the end, and the finding was not immediate or inevitable, but was the result of the particular habit that Orome had, alone among the Valar, of riding through Middle-earth in the ages before the children awoke. Moving through its forests and across its plains and along its shores with the attention of someone who loved the world for its own sake, rather than as a project to be managed or a dwelling to be prepared. He was a hunter, and hunters learn to pay a quality of attention to the world they move through, that other modes of engagement with the world do not require, to notice the specific rather than the general, to read the particular quality of an environment at a given moment, rather than simply registering its broad characteristics, to understand that a forest is not simply a forest, but a forest at a specific moment of its history, with specific things happening in it that a sufficiently attentive observer can perceive and interpret. He rode through the east of Middle-earth on his great horse Nahar, whose coat was white, and whose hooves struck light from the ground as he moved. And in the darkness near Cuiviénen he perceived something that the tradition describes simply as a change in the quality of the darkness, a sense that the forest around him was inhabited by a presence different from anything he had encountered before in his long riding, something new and something singing. The singing was, in the understanding that later ages developed for what Orome had heard, the elves doing what the elves had been doing since the first days of their existence, which was making language into music, and music into the most direct possible expression of their experience of being alive in a world full of things worth paying attention to. They sang about the stars and about the water, and about the faces of those they loved, and about the darkness that had been taking their people from the shore, because even the darkness had by now been incorporated into the elvish encounter with existence, had become something that the language was reaching toward and the music was trying to hold and understand. Orome heard this singing across the darkness of the eastern forest, and sat very still on Nahar's back for a long moment, in the way of someone who has heard something that exceeds their immediate capacity for response, and who needs the stillness to give the experience its proper weight. And then he turned toward the sound, toward the shore, toward the water that carried in it the reflection of the stars, toward the 68 and their growing community of new-made people who had been alone in the darkness long enough, and who were, though they did not yet know it, about to learn that the world contained powers that wished them well. But the shadow that Melkor had already cast across the shore of Cuiviénen was not something that Orom's arrival could undo or erase, or simply make not to have happened, because the elves who had been taken were gone, and what had been made of them in the darkness of Melkor's keeping was already made, already moving through the world in a form so completely transformed from its original nature, that not even the loving attention of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth could find in it the thread that led back to the shore and the starlight and the first singing. The orcs were in the world. They were in the world because the elves had been in the world first, and because something vast and cold and without remorse had found them before their protectors did and had done to them the thing that the oldest accounts name with such careful and deliberate restraint. This is the shadow that falls across the entire subsequent history of the elvish people, not as an external darkness they could set aside when the immediate danger had passed, but as something internal, something woven into the fabric of what they were and what they had lost, the knowledge that the thing that hunted them in the forest near Cuiviénen had made its weapons from their own people, that the enemy's army was built from the ruins of the family, and that somewhere in the deep structure of every orc that would ever march under Melkor's banner, there persisted, unreachable and unrescuable, but not entirely absent, the faintest and most tragic echo of a mind that had once looked up at the stars on the water and made a sound of pure and unguarded joy. Orm did not immediately announce himself to the elves on the shore of Cuiviénen, and the tradition is thoughtful in its explanation of why, because the reason reveals something important about the quality of attention that the Valar brought to the elvish people in those first moments of contact, a quality that was the precise opposite of the attention Melkor had brought, and that distinguished itself from Melkor's approach not merely in its intentions, but in its fundamental method, in the basic posture of the consciousness doing the attending. Melkor had approached the elves as objects, as material to be acquired and processed and transformed into something useful to his own purposes, and his approach had therefore been one of concealment and speed, and the exploitation of vulnerability, the approach of something that wished to act upon a thing before the thing became aware of being acted upon. Orome approached them as subjects, as beings whose own experience of what was happening mattered, and whose capacity for fear in the presence of the unknown was a fact to be respected and worked around rather than a weakness to be exploited, and so he waited at the edge of the forest for a time, simply present, allowing the sound of Nahar's breathing and the faint light that moved around him to reach the shore gradually, to become part of the elves' experience of the world before he himself became part of it, so that when he finally rode out of the trees and into the starlight, his arrival was not a shock but a culmination, the resolution of something that had been building rather than a disruption, of something that had been still. Even so, the fear was real. The oldest accounts are honest about this, honest in the way that all genuine traditions of difficult history are honest, acknowledging that the response of the elves on the shore of Cuiviénen to their first sight of Orome was not uniform and not entirely welcoming. Well, that some of them fled into the forest, and some of them stood their ground with the particular quality of stillness that is not courage in the easy sense, but the body's refusal to move when the mind has not yet determined in which direction movement would be advisable, and that only a few, the ones who would later be identified in the tradition as the first and the most important of the elvish leaders, moved toward him. The fear was understandable, and the tradition treats it as such, because the elves had spent an unmeasured period of their early existence watching their people disappear into the darkness from the direction of the forest, and the thing that had emerged from that forest now, enormous and blazing with a light and a power that was unlike anything in their experience, could not immediately be distinguished by minds that had not yet developed the conceptual tools for distinguishing between different categories of vast and powerful presences from the things that had taken their people. That some of them recognized the difference, recognized in Orome's light and presence a quality that was the opposite of the cold, purposeful darkness that had been hunting them, is itself remarkable, and the tradition treats it as a kind of prophetic gift, the first expression of the elvish capacity for discernment that would be one of their defining characteristics across all the ages to come. Orome gave them time. He returned to Valinor and brought to the Valar the news that the children of Ilúvatar had awoken, and the response in Valinor was of an intensity that the tradition describes in terms of light suddenly increased, of a brightening and a quickening in the Blessed Realm that expressed the emotional reality of what the Valar were experiencing in the only terms that the physical world had available for such expression. The elves had come. The theme from the music had become people, had become 68 conscious beings beside a cold inland sea in the east of the world, speaking their own language and singing their own songs, and already, in the time since their awakening, becoming themselves in the specific and irreplaceable ways that only the lived experience of existing in the world can produce. Manwë, the Elder King, considered what had been reported to him, and what he understood from it was that the situation in the East was not one that could be addressed by sending a representative or dispatching a message, that what the moment required was the full attention of the Valar and a decision of the kind that would shape the entire subsequent history of both the elvish people and the world they had woken into. The decision that was made, after deliberation that the tradition suggests was neither brief nor without genuine disagreement, was to make war on Melkor. Not immediately, and not without preparation, but as a determined course of action. A commitment to removing from the world the power that had been preying on the elves in the darkness near Cuiviénen, and that would, if left unchallenged, continue to do so with increasing confidence and increasing effect as the elvish population grew and Melkor's understanding of their nature deepened. The war that followed, the first great war of Arda, is not the primary subject of this movement of the story, but its outcome is, because the outcome was the capture of Melkor and his binding in the chains of Angenor, and his imprisonment in the halls of Mandos for a term of 3 ages, and this removal of the immediate threat from the east created the conditions under which the question of what was to become of the elves could be addressed with something approaching the full deliberate care that the question deserved. The Valar could not unmake what Melkor had already done on the shore of Cuiviénen, but they could, and did, turn their attention toward what remained, toward the elves who had survived the age of predation, and who were now, in the relative safety that Melkor's imprisonment had produced, beginning to grow in number and in the richness and complexity of the culture they were building around the Water of Awakening. It was into this relative safety, this first breath of an age less shadowed than the one that had preceded it, that the summons came. Orome returned to Cuiviénen, and this time his arrival was received very differently, because the elves had had time to develop a relationship to his presence, and to the quality of light and power he carried with him, had had time to understand through repeated encounter that he was not the darkness but its opposite, not the thing that hunted them but the thing that stood between them and the hunting. He came as he had come before, on Nahar through the eastern forests, and this time the elves came to meet him. And what he brought them was the invitation of the Valar, the summons to the west, the offer of a journey across the whole breadth of Middle-earth to the shores of the Great Sea, and beyond it to Ammon, to the light of the 2 trees and the protection of the Blessed Realm, and the company of the powers who had made the world and who wished, with a genuineness that the most perceptive of the elvish leaders could feel in the quality of the invitation itself, to know the people whose theme in the great music had moved them to something close to tears. The response of the elves to this invitation was not unanimous, and the tradition is meticulous in its insistence that it should not have been, that the question of whether to leave the land of one's awakening and undertake a journey of unknown length and difficulty toward a destination one had never seen and could not fully imagine was a question that admitted of more than one reasonable answer, and that the elves who gave different answers to it were not simply divided into the wise and the unwise, the faithful and the faithless, but were people of genuine thought and genuine attachment, making a genuine choice about something that mattered profoundly to them in ways that were specific to their individual natures and their individual relationships to the world they already knew. The elves were at this point a people of 3 broad groupings, the 3 kindreds that the tradition traces back to the 3 original pairs who had woken first on the shore of Cuiviénen, and the response to the summons was shaped, in ways that would determine the entire subsequent history of the elvish world, by the specific character and disposition and leadership of each of those 3 kindreds. The first and smallest kindred, those who would be known as the Vanya, were led by a man called Ingwe, and his response to the summons was of an immediacy and a simplicity that the tradition treats with a respect bordering on reverence, not because simplicity is always wisdom, but because Ingwe's simplicity was rooted in something genuinely deep, a quality of orientation toward the light, and toward the highest things that was as native to his character as the colour of the stars he had spent the first age of his existence watching. He wished to go. He had heard the description of the 2 trees, and of Valinor and of the elder king who sat upon his throne in Ilmarin and looked out over the whole of Arda, and something in him had recognised what he was hearing as the thing he had been, without knowing it, oriented toward since the moment of his waking. His people followed him with a completeness that the other kindreds did not replicate, because Ingwe was the kind of leader whose certainty is persuasive without being coercive, whose direction feels less like instruction and more like the articulation of something the people around him had already been feeling but had not yet found the words for. The second kindred, the Noldor, were more complicated in their response, because the Noldor were always more complicated in their response to everything, their minds being of a kind that engaged with every question as a genuine question rather than a settled matter, that turned possibilities over and examined them from multiple angles, and wanted to understand not just what was being offered, but why it was being offered, and what the full implications of accepting or declining might be. Their leader in this period was Finwë, a man of great warmth and great practical intelligence, and a quality of personal presence that drew people to him not through the assertion of authority but through the simple fact of being. In any room and in any conversation, the person most completely and most generously present in it. Finwë wanted to go, and his reasons were characteristically more elaborate than Ingwe's, rooted in an understanding of what the journey and the destination might mean for the Noldor's development as craftspeople and as thinkers, in a sense that the resources of Valinor, the light and the company of the Valar, and the accumulated knowledge of beings who had been present at the making of the world were resources that the Noldor's particular gifts were designed to work with, and that remaining in Middle-earth would be remaining at a remove from the fullest possible expression of what they could become. He persuaded most of his people, though not all, and the ones he did not persuade became the first of what the later tradition would call the Avari, the unwilling, a name that carries in its original tongue both the simple meaning of those who refused and the faint additional resonance of those who turned away, with all the ambiguity about whether the turning was a refusal or a preservation that that resonance implies. The third kindred, the Teleri, were the largest of the three and the most various in their response, and their leader, or rather the man who would have been their unquestioned leader had he not become, in the very period when the question of the journey was being decided, unavailable for leadership in a way that no one had anticipated, was Elwysingolo, whose story belongs to the next chapter of this account, and whose absence from the decision about the great journey shaped the fate of his people in ways so far-reaching that they're still working themselves out in the ages when the last Elvish ships sail from the Grey Havens into the west. What is relevant here is that the Teleri, even without Elwy's full leadership, agreed in their majority to undertake the journey, though with a reluctance and a qualification that were characteristically their own, a reluctance rooted not in any failure of courage or of faith, but in the particular quality of their attachment to the world they already knew, to the sound of water and the feeling of wind and the specific texture of a landscape that had been, for the length of their conscious lives, the whole of existence. The Valar sent guides for the journey, and the host of the Eldar, as those who agreed to undertake the westward road, were called. Those who answered the summons and set their faces toward the light they had not yet seen, gathered on the shore of Cuivienen for the last time. The tradition records this moment with the kind of attention that is given to things that are both joyful and irreversible. Things that are completely themselves, and in being completely themselves, are also endings, also the last occurrence of something that cannot be returned to once the step forward has been taken. They stood at the water's edge, the Vanya and the Noldor and the Teleri, the people of Ingwe and Finwë and the people who were still waiting for Elwë to return from wherever he had gone, and they looked at the stars on the water one more time, and the tradition does not record whether any of them wept, but the silence of the accounts on this point has always seemed, to the scholars who have spent their lives inside these texts, like the silence of restraint rather than the silence of absence, like the kind of not saying that is itself a form of saying, a recognition that some moments are too complete to be annotated without diminishing them. And then those who were going turned west, and the great journey began. The road was long beyond the reckoning of any measurement that the elves yet possessed. They were crossing a continent that the Valar had shaped across ages of geological time, a continent of mountain ranges that had been raised by the conflict of enormous powers, and that were therefore not merely obstacles in the landscape but expressions of that conflict, bearing in their stone the memory of forces so vast that the passage of an elvish host across them, however numerous and however determined, was a small thing by comparison, a brief local event in the long, slow life of rock and ice. The misty mountains rose before them, and the Hitheglir, and the Blue Mountains, the Ered Luin, and beyond the Ered Luin, the long forests of Beleriand and the rivers that ran through them, and the western shore, where the great sea waited with a sound and a scale that none of them had been prepared for by anything in their experience of the inland water of Cuivienen, a sound that was not the sound of still water reflecting stars, but the sound of something vast and purposeful, and entirely indifferent to the smallness of the beings who stood at its edge, and looked out across it toward a light they could not yet see, but that some of them, in the still hours before dawn, believed they could feel, a warmth on the face that came from no identifiable source, a direction that was not east and was not west in the ordinary sense, but was simply, in the precise emotional vocabulary of the elvish perception, toward. But not all of them reached that shore, and not all of those who had set out from Cuivienen remained together long enough to complete the journey in any form. The road west was also the road along which the elvish people, who'd been one people in the sense of sharing an origin and a language and a shore, began to become several peoples, the road along which the sundering occurred that would shape all of elvish history from that moment forward, the divergence of paths that sent some elves to the light of Valinor and left others in the darkness of Middle-earth, and produced, from what had been a single community of 68 people beside a cold inland sea, the full complexity of the elvish world with all its different cultures and different languages and different understandings of what it meant to be what they were. The Great Journey was the journey by which the elves became themselves in the fullest and most various sense of that phrase, which is to say that it was also the journey by which they became separate from one another, by which the community of the shore became, through the exercise of individual will and individual attachment and individual vision, something more complex and more irrecoverably divided than the shore had been. They walked west, and as they walked they became, and what they became was not one thing but many things, not a single answer to the question of what the elvish people were, but a constellation of answers, each one true, each one partial, each one carrying within it the starlight of Cuiviénen, and the long shadow of the forest, and the particular quality of the choice that had been made at the water's edge, when the summons came from the west, and each person had looked inside themselves for an answer, and found there something that was entirely and irreducibly their own. The great journey westward was not a single unbroken movement, but a migration that proceeded in stages, pausing and resuming according to the needs of the host and the council of the Valar's guides, and it was during one of these pauses, at the feet of the misty mountains where the road ahead rose sharply into passes that were cold and dark and narrow enough to make the enormity of what was being attempted feel suddenly and physically present in a way that open country did not, that the first great sundering of the travelling host occurred. The Nandor, as they would come to be called, were a portion of the Teleri who stood at the foot of those mountains and looked up at what lay between them and the west, and made, with the quiet completeness of people who have reached the end of their willingness to continue in a direction that no longer feels like their own, the decision to go no further. Their leader was a man called Lenwë, and the tradition treats him with a respect that is neither uncomplicated nor unkind, recognizing in his choice not a failure of courage or of faith, but the expression of a genuine and deeply held understanding of what the journey was costing, and what the world behind him contained that the world ahead, however luminous in its promised qualities, could not be certain to replace. Lenwë looked at the mountains, and then he looked back at the forests they had crossed to reach them, the long forests of the east with their rivers and their wildness, and the particular quality of life that moved through them, unmade by any deliberate hand and therefore completely itself in the way that only unmade things can be, and something in him recognized with a clarity that required no argument, and admitted of no refutation, that the world he was being invited to leave was the world he actually belonged to, that the call toward the light in the west was real, and that he did not doubt the reality of what awaited those who answered it fully, but that his own answering of it had reached its natural limit here, at the foot of the mountains, with the smell of eastern forest still present in the air behind him, and the cold stone of the passes rising before him, into a sky that was the sky of the world he knew, rather than the sky of the world he was being asked to go toward. He turned south, and a significant portion of the Telerin host turned with him, and they moved away from the westward road and disappeared into the forests of Middle-earth, and became, in the understanding of the later elvish world, the Nandor, the people who turned back, a name that carries in it the whole weight of a choice that was neither shameful nor simple, and that produced, over the ages that followed, peoples and cultures and forms of elvish life that were as genuine and as beautiful as anything the westward journey eventually achieved, even if the grand tradition of elvish history, written largely by those who completed the journey and who could not entirely divest themselves of the perspective that completion gave them, did not always treat them with the full generosity they deserved. The rest of the Teleri continued west, diminished in number and newly aware of the way in which the journey was revealing, through the choices it demanded, the true shape of each individual's relationship to their own deepest nature, the things they could not leave and the things they could not resist, and the places where those two categories overlapped in ways that no amount of prior reflection could have predicted. They moved through the long forests of what would eventually be called Beleriand, crossing rivers whose names they were already beginning to give in the new dialects that the journey itself was producing. The slow differentiation of the single language of Cuiviénen into the family of related tongues that the full sundering would eventually generate. They were still a great host, still the largest of the three kindreds, still the people who sang most beautifully, and who were most completely attuned to the sounds of water and wind, and the particular music that the world makes, when a sufficiently attentive consciousness is present to receive it. And their leader was still Elwa Singolo, who was by any reckoning among the most remarkable of all the elvish people who had set out from Cuiviénen, tall and silver-haired, and possessed of a quality of presence so pronounced that those who encountered him for the first time often described the experience in the same physical terms that the tradition uses for the encounter with the Valar themselves, as something felt in the body before it was processed by the mind, a recognition of magnitude that operated below the level of conscious assessment. It was Elwë who had been among the first of the elvish ambassadors sent to Valinor before the great journey began. Sent ahead with Ingwe and Finwë to see the light of the two trees, and to bring back to their people the testimony of those who had witnessed what they were being invited toward. And the tradition records that of the three ambassadors, Elwë was the one most deeply affected by what he encountered there, that the light of Valinor entered him in a way that was different from the way it entered his companions, not less profound in their cases, but differently located in his, settled into something more particular and more personal, connected not to the general beauty of the Blessed Realm, but as something he had perceived there that was specifically and irreversibly his own. He returned to his people, as the other ambassadors did, to report what he had seen and to speak in favour of the journey, and his testimony had the force that his presence always had, the force of someone speaking from genuine and unmediated experience about something they had been irrevocably changed by. His people listened and they believed him, and they agreed to go, and he led them westward, and for a long portion of the journey everything proceeded as it should. And then, in the forests of Nan Elmeth, in the region of Beleriand, where the trees were older and denser than anywhere else in the long westward road, where the canopy was so complete that the stars above it might as well have been in another world, Elwë heard singing. The tradition is very careful with this moment, careful in the way of accounts that understand they are describing the pivot of an enormous story, the specific instant when everything that was proceeding in one direction turned and went in another, irreversibly, with consequences so far-reaching that they would still be working themselves out in ages that those involved could not have imagined. The singing came from deeper in the forest, from a place where the trees were thickest and the darkness was most absolute, and it was of a quality so wholly unlike anything Elwë had heard before, so entirely in a category of its own, that the only way the tradition can describe his response to it is to say that he walked toward it without deciding to walk toward it, that his feet moved and his body followed before his mind had completed the process of determining whether following was wise or advisable or consistent with his responsibilities to the host that was waiting for him on the road, and depending on his leadership to bring them through the forest to the shore and the sea in the west. The singer was Melian. She was a Maya, one of the great spirits who had descended into the world in the service of the Valar, and she was of a kind and a power that was entirely her own within that category. A being whose gifts were not the gifts of making or unmaking, or the management of physical forces, but something subtler and in its own way more profound, the gifts of enchantment in the original and most literal sense of the word, the capacity to work upon the world and upon the minds of those within it through the medium of beauty, through music and through the quality of presence that radiated from her, as light radiates from a source of light, not something she produced deliberately or strategically, but something she simply was, an expression of her nature that she could not have withheld even if she had wished to. She was sitting in Nan Elmeth among the trees, singing something that the tradition declines to specify in content because the content was not the point, or rather because the content was everything, and the everything defies the specificity that a quotation would imply. And when Elwë came through the trees and saw her, everything that had been proceeding in his life up to that moment stopped. The tradition uses the word enchantment for what happened, and it uses it precisely, not in the loose sense of being charmed or delighted, but in the strict sense of a magical event, a thing that happened to Elwë rather than a thing he chose, a state that descended on him from outside his own will, and held him in it with a completeness that made the exercise of his will, in the ordinary sense of deliberate choice between available options, simply irrelevant for the duration. He stood in the forest of Nan Elmeth, and looked at Melian, and she looked at him, and between them something passed that the tradition describes as recognition, the recognition of two beings who were, in some sense, that neither of them had known before this moment, and that both of them understood immediately and completely in this moment, made for each other's knowing. Shaped in their deepest natures as complements, rather than as separate and self-contained entities, who happened to have encountered one another in a forest. He stood there for a very long time. The tradition says years, which, even allowing for the possibility of poetic elaboration, suggests a duration that is not metaphorical but actual, a span of time during which the rest of the world continued its processes and Elwy did not, during which the host of the Teleri waited at the edge of the forest and then searched for their leader, and then waited again, and then sent messengers, and then searched again, and then, gradually, with the particular grief of people who have understood something they did not wish to understand, accepted that Elwy was not coming back to them, or not coming back in the way they needed him to come back in order for the journey to continue. What the Teleri did in response to this loss is perhaps the most defining thing about them as a people, more defining even than their music or their love of water, because it was a choice that expressed at the most fundamental level what they valued and what they understood themselves to be. A significant portion of them refused to leave, not in the way that the Nandor had refused at the mountains, from a settled decision that the journey was not theirs to make, but from a refusal that was specifically and personally about Elwy, about their leader and their kinsman, and the man whose presence had been, for the whole of their conscious lives, one of the fundamental conditions of their world. They would not go to Valinor without him. This was not a policy position or a philosophical stance, but something closer to the expression of a loyalty so complete that it constituted a definition of identity, the statement that what they were was inseparable from who they were with, that the self that would arrive in Valinor without Elwë would be a different self from the one that had stood on the shore of Cuiviénen and sung the first songs and walked the long road west, different in a way that made the journey's destination feel less like a fulfillment than a loss. The others, led now by Olwe, Elwë's brother, did eventually continue west, and their story will be told in its proper place, because what they built in Valinor and what was asked of them there is one of the great tragic pivots of all of Elvish history. But the ones who stayed, the ones who waited in Beleriand for a leader who would not return for a very long time, and who would return changed beyond what they had known of him, became in their waiting something that they had not been before the waiting began. They spread through the forests and the river valleys of Beleriand, learning the land with the particular intimacy that long residence in a place produces, the knowledge that is not information but relationship, not the inventory of a place's features but the felt sense of its character, of its moods in different weathers and different seasons and different hours of the day and night, the way a person knows the face of someone they have loved for a very long time, not as a collection of features but as an expression of a specific and irreplaceable interior life. They became the Sindar, the Grey Elves, and the grey of their name was not a grey of diminishment or of compromise, but the grey of the world they actually lived in, the world of mist and stone and the light that comes between darkness and the full brightness of day. The world of middle distances and the particular beauty of things that are neither the absolute dark nor the absolute light, but the endlessly varied and endlessly interesting space between. They built, in those years of waiting and of learning the land, what would eventually become the culture of the Sindar, a culture that was entirely their own, shaped by Beleriand rather than by Valinor, by the rivers and the forests and the starlight of Middle-earth rather than by the light of the two trees that their kin in the west were even now beginning to encounter and be transformed by. Their language, which had been at the time of the Great Journey the same language as the Teleri who continued west, began to change in ways that reflected their different experience, to incorporate into its sounds and its rhythms and its vocabulary the specific quality of the world they were actually living in rather than the world they had left or the world they had not arrived at. So that Sindarin and the Telerin of Valinor, which began as dialects of the same tongue, became over the ages of separation genuinely different languages, recognizably related and mutually informative for those who studied them carefully, but no longer immediately mutually intelligible, which is itself a record of the depth and the duration of the separation, of how completely two groups of people who had once been one people had each grown into their own specific relationship with the world around them, and in the forest of Nan Elmoth Elwy stood with Melian and the years accumulated around them with the patience of something that knows it has all the time that is needed, and eventually the enchantment, if enchantment is even the right word for something that became, as the years passed, indistinguishable from love in its fullest and most chosen sense. The enchantment resolved not into release but into union, and Elwy emerged from Nan Elmoth with Melian beside him. And he was not the same as he had been when he entered it, not the silver-haired leader of a travelling host, but something more than that, changed by the years of standing in the presence of a Maya, in the way that everything is changed by long proximity to something of great power and great beauty, deepened and stilled and possessed of a quality of gravitas that the tradition describes as the gravitas of someone who has seen something that most people do not see, and that the seeing has permanently altered them. He was Elu Thingol now, which means in the Sindarin his people had developed in his absence King Greycloak, and he was the Lord of Beleriand, the king of the Sindar who had waited for him in the forests and the river valleys, and who came to him now with the particular joy of people whose patient loyalty has been, at last and completely vindicated. Together, Thingol and Melian built Doriath. The name means in its oldest form the land of the fence. And the fence was Melian's gift, the thing she made from her own power and her own will, and the deep understanding of enchantment that was her native mode of being in the world. An invisible barrier of such extraordinary magical density and complexity that it enclosed the whole of the forest kingdom of Doriath in a protection that was less like a wall than like a change in the nature of reality at the border, a place where the world as it existed outside Doriath and the world as it existed inside it were not simply separated by a physical barrier, but were genuinely different in character, so that the forest within the girdle had a quality of light and of life and of time that was entirely its own, an enclave of preserved and concentrated beauty in the middle of a world that was still, for all the temporary absence of Melkor. A world in which dark things moved and difficult things happened, and the elvish people who lived outside the girdle were exposed to all of it without the kind of protection that Melian's nature made possible, and that her love for Thingol and his people motivated her to provide. Menegroth, the Thousand Caves, was the heart of Doriath, the dwelling that Thingol and Melian built beneath a hill beside the river Esgalduin, with the help of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains with whom Thingol had established, in the careful and respectful manner of someone who understood that the world was larger than his own people, and that the other peoples in it had their own gifts and their own dignity, a relationship of genuine mutual regard and creative collaboration. The caves were carved into something that the tradition can only describe by accumulation, by listing the things they contained and the qualities of light that moved through them and the sounds that filled them. Because no single image is adequate to the totality of Menegroth at the height of its beauty, which was a beauty of the same order as the beauty of the world's greatest natural formations, but deliberate, intentional, the beauty of things that have been thought about and cared for and made with the full attention of minds and hands that understood what they were doing and loved it. There were halls whose ceilings were carved into the forms of the canopy above, so that the forest was both outside and inside, both the world and the image of the world held within the world's most beautiful room. There were fountains whose water ran through channels of such subtle design that the sound they produced was not the sound of water in a channel, but the sound of a stream in a forest, wild and various and entirely itself. There were figures carved into the living rock that were not representations of the inhabitants of Doriath, or of the Valar, or of any being from the history of the world, but expressions of the forms that the stone itself suggested to the hands working it, as though the rock had always contained those shapes, and the carving had simply been the process of finding them. This was the kingdom that the Teleri who had refused to go on without Elwë had built by staying, built not by abandoning the journey, but by arriving. Through their faithfulness to something they could not leave behind, at a destination that the journey as originally conceived had not contained. They had gone nowhere, and in going nowhere they had become themselves, fully and specifically and irreversibly, in the way that only happens when a people and a landscape have had enough time together to grow into each other, to become mutually expressive, to develop the kind of relationship where it is no longer entirely clear which has shaped the other more completely. Doriath was the Sindar and the Sindar were Doriath, and both were Beleriand and Beleriand was Middle-earth, the actual world, the world of mist and stone and starlight rather than the world of the two trees and the eternal light of the west. And at the centre of all of it stood Thingol, who had been lost in a forest for longer than most of his people had been alive, and who had returned not diminished by the loss but made larger by it, made more completely himself. As though what had seemed from the outside like an abandonment of his purpose had been, from the inside, the most direct possible route to it. While Thingol and Melian were weaving Doriath into being in the forests of Beleriand, while the Sindar were growing into their grey and beautiful kingdom beside the river Esgalduin, and beneath the stars that had always been and remained the primary illumination of Middle-earth, the rest of the elvish host that had continued west was completing its journey, arriving at last at the shores of the Great Sea and crossing it, in ships built by the Teleri who had settled on the western coast, and who had, in the years of their waiting for a passage, become the greatest mariners in the history of the world by the simple and inevitable process of spending so much time at the edge of the water that the water became part of them. Part of their understanding of what beauty was and what existence felt like, and what the world was made of at its most fundamental level. The crossing was not instantaneous, and it was not without its own complications that belong to the larger story of the Teleri's arrival in Valinor, and that will be addressed in their proper place. But what matters here is the arrival, the moment when those who had walked the entirety of the great journey and crossed the sea at its end came at last to the shores of Aman, and stood for the first time in the light of the two trees, and understood, in the way that only direct physical experience can produce understanding, what it was that Ingwe and Finwë and Elwë had tried to describe to them when they returned from their first embassy to the Blessed Realm. The light was unlike anything in Middle-earth. This is the fact that every account of the arrival in Valinor begins with, because it is the fact that everything else proceeds from, the fact that the world the elves had known before this moment, and the world they had arrived in were genuinely different in their most basic physical character. Different not in the way that one landscape differs from another, but in the way that the presence of light differs from its absence, fundamentally and categorically, and in a way that altered the experience of every sense simultaneously. The light of the two trees was not the light of the sun, which had not yet been made, and it was not the light of the stars, which was the only light the elves had known in Middle-earth, and it was not the light of fire, which they had also known and which was warm and companionable, but small, bounded, a local event rather than a condition of the world. It was something that had no equivalent in any experience the arriving elves carried with them, a light that was alive in the way that growing things are alive, that changed as the trees completed their cycles of brightening and dimming and brightening again, mingling silver and gold in the hours between cycles in a blended radiance that the tradition describes consistently and across all its various accounts with a single phrase, as the most beautiful thing that had ever been seen by anyone who had eyes with which to see. Telperion was the elder of the two trees, the silver one, whose flowers were like stars made physical, and whose light fell on the surfaces it touched, with a quality of gentleness that seemed to have intention in it, to be specifically responsive to the things it illuminated in a way that ordinary light is not, to bring out in each surface it fell on the specific quality of beauty that was most native to that surface, rather than simply revealing it in a general and indiscriminate way. Its light was the light of deep consideration, the light in which things became most fully themselves, because the illumination they were given was precisely calibrated to what they were. The tradition uses a word for it that translates only approximately as silver, because the silver it describes is not the silver of metal, or of stars, or of water under moonlight, but a silver that was those things, and also more than those things, a silver that had in it the quality of all the cool and quiet and reflective forms of beauty that the world contained, distilled and intensified and offered freely to everything within its reach. Laurelin was younger and more brilliant, the gold tree whose light was of a warmth and a generosity so complete that it was not merely light, but something closer to affirmation, a quality of radiance that seemed to address itself to the living things that received it, as though they were specifically intended to receive it, as though the light had been made with them in mind. Where Telperion's light was contemplative and inward, Laurelin's was expansive and vital, the light in which growth happened most naturally and colour was most fully saturated, and the world appeared to be operating at the peak of its expressive capacity, everything visible being most completely and most joyfully what it was. In the hours when the two lights mingled, in the gradual transitions between Telperion's brightening and Laurelin's brightening and back again, the quality of illumination in Valinor achieved something that the tradition can only approach through the language of music, describing it as a chord in which two distinct voices are present simultaneously and in perfect relationship, each audible as itself and both together producing something that neither alone could have generated, something that resolved the apparent opposition between contemplation and vitality into a unity that was more true than either quality in isolation. The elves who arrived in Valinor and stood for the first time in this light were changed by it, in ways that were both immediate and lasting, changed in the way that all profound and genuine encounters with beauty change the people who undergo them, not by adding something external to what they already were, but by making more fully available something that had always been present in them, drawing out capacities and qualities and forms of perception that the conditions of Middle-earth had not fully activated. They became, in Valinor, more completely themselves, which sounds like a simple statement but is in fact a very large one, because what the elves already were in Middle-earth was already remarkable, already the most gifted and the most beautiful kind of conscious being that the world had produced, and the intensification of those qualities under the light of the two trees produced effects that the tradition can only describe by pointing to what the elves of Valinor made and thought and became across the long ages of the years of the trees, the accumulated achievement of a people operating at the fullest possible expression of their nature, under conditions specifically designed, whether by deliberate intention or by the deep logic of a world in which things have their proper places, to support and to extend that expression. The Vanya settled first and most completely, finding their place in Valinor with the ease of people who have arrived at the destination toward which they were always most fundamentally oriented. They settled closest to the light, on the slopes of Tanicatil, the highest mountain in the world, at the peak of which Manwë and Vardar had their dwelling, Ilmarin, the Hall of the Winds, and in this proximity to the seat of the Elder King and his queen, the Vanyar found both a physical expression of the quality of their nature and a relationship with the Vala that went deeper and more quickly than the relationship that the other kindreds developed, because the Vanyar were people whose orientation toward the highest things was not a posture they adopted or a value they reasoned their way to, but something constitutional, something that expressed itself naturally and inevitably in where they chose to be and who they chose to be near. They became the most beloved of all the elvish peoples by the Valar, the tradition says, and the tradition says it without envy, or with only the most carefully modulated envy, because the Vanyar's closeness to the Valar came at its own kind of cost, the cost of becoming, across the long ages of their dwelling on the slopes of Tanicatil, somewhat remote from the rest of the world and from the rest of the elvish people, somewhat insulated from the pressures and the griefs and the difficult questions that the other kindreds were navigating, so that their beauty was the beauty of something that has been protected rather than the beauty of something that has been tested, which is a genuine beauty but a different one, and the difference matters in the long accounting of things. The Noldor settled in Tirion, the city they built upon the hill of Tuna in the Calasyria, the pass through the Pelori where the light of the two trees flowed through into the darkness of the outer world and reached, faintly and in diminished form, the shores of Middle-earth, becoming the light of the stars as it dispersed over that enormous distance. Tirion upon Tuna was the city of the Noldor, and it was the first city, the first genuinely urban concentration of elvish life in the history of the world, and the tradition treats it as such, as an achievement that was not merely architectural but conceptual, the expression of a new understanding of what it meant to live together in large numbers with shared institutions and shared spaces, and the particular kind of creative collaboration that proximity and the division of labour make possible. The Noldor were craftspeople above all things, were makers in the deeper sense of the word, and the city they built in Tirion was a demonstration of what making could achieve when it was performed by minds of the highest quality, operating under optimal conditions of light and peace, and the encouraging attention of beings who understood what they were doing and found it remarkable. The towers of Tirion were the first towers built by any of the children of Ilúvatar, and they rose above the hill of Tuna with a confidence and an intricacy that reflected the particular quality of Noldorin ambition, which was never ambition in the narrow sense of the desire for prominence or power, but ambition in the broader and more interesting sense of the desire to find out how completely a thing could be done, how close to its own deepest potential a material or a form or an idea could be pushed by the application of sufficient intelligence and sufficient care. The stone they used was the white stone of the Pelori, which had in Valinor's light a quality of luminosity that stone in Middle-earth did not possess, and the things they carved from it were carved with tools that were themselves works of art, tools made with the same attention and the same love as the things they were used to make, because the Noldor understood, with a consistency that distinguished them from every other people in the history of the world, that the instrument and the work are not separable categories, that the quality of the tool is present in the quality of what the tool makes, and that the care given to the means is indistinguishable from the care given to the ends. They learned from the Valar in those early years in Tirion, with the hunger of minds that have encountered for the first time a source of knowledge adequate to their capacity for absorbing it. Aula the Smith, whose gifts in the crafting of physical things were the greatest among all the Valar, taught the Noldor and was taught by them in return, because the relationship between a teacher of extraordinary gifts and students of extraordinary gifts is never simply one-directional, but is a genuine exchange, each party discovering in the other's approach to the same material a perspective that enriches and complicates and ultimately deepens their own. The techniques the Noldor developed in those early centuries in Tirion, techniques of metalworking and gemcraft and the making of instruments both practical and musical, were techniques that went beyond anything Aula had shown them, were extensions and developments of what they had been taught that reflected the specific quality of the Noldorin mind, its restlessness and its precision, and its particular form of aesthetic intelligence, which was not the intelligence of someone who perceives beauty and records it, but the intelligence of someone who perceives beauty and immediately begins to understand how it works, what principles underlie it, how those principles might be extended and varied and applied in contexts that no one has yet attempted. The greatest of all the Noldor in those years was not yet the greatest of all the Noldor. He was a child in Tirion, the son of Finwë the king, and his first wife Míriel Therinde, and his name was Feanaro, which translates as Spirit of Fire, a name that his mother gave him, and that the tradition accepts as the most precisely accurate name in all of Elvish history, the name that was most completely what the person it named actually was. Míriel gave all of herself in the bearing of this child, all of her strength and all of her spirit, poured into him with such completeness that when he was born she had nothing left to sustain her own continuation, and she laid down in the gardens of Lorien, who was the Vala of dreams and rest, and slept, and did not wake again, her Fea, her spirit, departing from her body not in the manner of those who are slain, but in the manner of one who has completed a task so perfectly and so totally that the completing of it has used up everything there was. This death, which was the first death of an elf in Valinor, and which was a death not of violence but of love in its most absolute and most costly expression, would cast its shadow over Feanor's entire life, would be one of the formative facts of the character that was already, even in childhood, the most remarkable character in the history of his people. He grew up in Tirion under his father's love and his father's careful attention, and the particular quality of grief that attaches to a father who sees in his child both the person he loved most and the reason he lost her, and he grew up in the light of the two trees that fell through the Calasyria and bathed the city in silver and gold, and he grew up in the workshops of the Noldor and the company of Aule and the accumulated craft knowledge of a people who were already producing work of extraordinary quality, and who recognized in this child, as he moved from childhood into the full, astonishing flower of his gifts, something that exceeded anything they had seen before or expected to see. The tradition does not exaggerate when it describes Feanor as the greatest of all the children of Ilúvatar in the matters of craft and of making. It is making an assessment that the evidence supports, and that even those who suffered most from the consequences of his choices acknowledged as accurate, because the greatness was real, and the tradition was honest enough to say so even when honesty required praising someone whose choices had produced irreversible catastrophe. But the years before the catastrophe were long and luminous, and in those years Valinor was what it had been built to be, the most beautiful place in the history of the world and the dwelling of the most gifted people it had yet produced, and the light of Telperion and Lorelin fell on all of it with the same patient generosity, on the towers of Tirion and the slopes of Tanika-Til and the harbours of Alcalonde, where the Teleri had eventually settled and were building their pearl-encrusted ships, and the days moved through their cycles of silver and gold and silver again, in the manner of something that has achieved a perfect equilibrium, and that could, if the world were the kind of world that could maintain perfect equilibria, have continued in that manner indefinitely, each cycle replacing the last with the same beauty in the same proportions, the same trees brightening and dimming in the same order, the same light falling on the same white city and the same silver sea, and the same faces of the same remarkable beings who had walked across the world to arrive at this impossible, beautiful place, and who were, in these long years of peace, becoming more themselves with every generation, more skilled and more knowledgeable and more deeply rooted in the specific quality of life that Valinor made possible. The Noldor in particular were restless even in paradise, and the tradition acknowledges this with a rueful affection, recognizing in the Noldorin restlessness not a deficiency or a dissatisfaction with what they had been given, but an expression of the very quality that made them who they were, the quality of minds that are constitutionally oriented toward what has not yet been made, toward the next question, and the next problem, and the next form of beauty that no one has yet achieved, so that the condition of having made something excellent immediately generates in them the awareness of the thing beyond the excellent thing that the excellent thing points toward. They were not unhappy in Tyrion. They were, in the way of people whose happiness is inseparable from their forward motion, happy in a manner that required the next thing to be approaching in order to sustain itself, and for a long time the next things kept coming, kept presenting themselves in the form of new techniques and new materials and new challenges, and the endlessly productive relationship with Orly and with each other that the concentration of gifted minds in a single city made continuously available. For a long time the forward motion was sufficient to maintain the happiness, and the happiness was sufficient to maintain the peace, and the peace was sufficient to maintain the light, and the light fell on the white towers of Tyrion and the silver trees of Valinor in the long and beautiful and not yet broken years that the tradition calls, with the full weight of retrospective knowledge, the noontide of the blessed realm. The noontide does not last, because nothing that is most completely itself at its peak can sustain that peak indefinitely, without the conditions that produced it beginning, at some point and in some way, to shift, and the noontide of Valinor carried within its own luminous perfection the specific seeds of what would end it, seeds that were not planted from outside, but that grew from the deepest and most genuine qualities of the people and the powers who inhabited the blessed realm, from the greatness itself rather than from any failure or corruption of the greatness. This is perhaps the most important and the most difficult thing to understand about what happened in Valinor in the years before the Darkening, that the catastrophe was not imposed upon a paradise from a purely external source, but was produced by the interaction of genuine greatness with genuine malice, in a way that neither alone could have generated, that it required both the extraordinary quality of what the Noldor were, and the extraordinary patience of the power that had decided to use that quality as the instrument of its own purposes. Melkor had been imprisoned in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages, bound in the chains of Angainor and held in a darkness that was the appropriate consequence of what he had done to the world and to the elves of Cuiviénen, and when his term of imprisonment ended and he came before Manwë and spoke words of repentance with the full force of his considerable gifts, applied to the performance of contrition, Manwë, who was the most magnanimous of all the Valar, and who found it genuinely difficult to conceive of a mind so different from his own that repentance could be performance rather than reality, released him. Melkor moved through Valinor in the years after his release with a patience that was, in retrospect, the most terrifying thing about him in this period, more terrifying than any open exercise of his power would have been, because the patience was the measure of the depth of his intention, the sign that what he was doing was not the impulsive action of a power that had been restrained and was now expressing itself freely, but the deliberate execution of a plan so carefully considered and so thoroughly prepared that haste was not merely unnecessary but counterproductive. He went among the elves, and particularly among the Noldor, and he brought to his interactions with them the full force of a mind that was, in terms of raw intellectual capacity, among the greatest that had ever existed in the history of the world, a mind that had spent 3 ages in darkness with nothing to do but think, refining its understanding of the elvish character and the elvish vulnerabilities and the specific forms of gift and pride and longing that could, if approached with sufficient subtlety, be turned from sources of strength into vectors of destruction. He was charming, in the way of beings whose charm is not a social surface, but a genuine expression of the intelligence and the attention they are capable of bringing to their interactions with others, the charm of someone who makes you feel that you are the most interesting person they have encountered, and that what you have made and thought and desired is of genuine and serious importance to them. He brought knowledge, which was perhaps the most insidious of his gifts to the Noldor, because the Noldor's relationship to knowledge was such that the offer of it bypassed many of the ordinary social defences that might have made them more cautious about the source. He told them things about the world that were true, or true enough to be indistinguishable from true by minds that lacked the specific knowledge required to identify the omissions and distortions that made them serve his purposes, true things embedded in a context that gave them a meaning they would not have carried in a more complete and more honest account. He told them about Middle-earth, about the breadth and the richness of the world that stretched east of Valinor, a world that the younger generations of the Noldor had never seen, and that their parents and grandparents had left without fully understanding what they were leaving, and he told it to them in a way that made the leaving seem like a loss rather than a gain, made the abundance and the freedom and the unmade quality of Middle-earth feel like something that had been taken from them, rather than something they had chosen to exchange for what they had received in Valinor. He whispered, which is the tradition's word for it, a word chosen with care for what it implies about the mode of communication, the intimacy and the selectivity of it, the way it positions the listener as the recipient of something not meant for everyone, something that creates between the speaker and the listener a complicity of knowing. And he whispered specifically about Feanor. What he told the Noldor about Feanor was not false in its facts, but was arranged with the precision of a craftsman, each true element placed in relationship to the others, in such a way that the picture that emerged was a portrait of someone whose gifts were being constrained, whose rightful inheritance was being withheld, whose position as the greatest of his people was being deliberately and systematically undermined by those who recognized in his excellence a threat to their own authority. The someone in question was Finwë, Feanor's father, and then later, as the story developed and as Melkor introduced new elements with the timing of someone who understood that information deployed in sequence has more power than information delivered all at once, the Valar themselves, who had, so the whispers suggested, brought the Noldor to Valinor not out of love or out of the genuine desire for their flourishing, that they claimed as their motivation, but for reasons of their own that had more to do with keeping the most powerful of the Elvish peoples within reach and under observation than with giving them the freedom and the light that they deserved. Feanor heard these whispers as all exceptional people hear things said about them that confirm their deepest anxieties about the relationship between their gifts and the world's willingness to accommodate those gifts. Which is to say that he heard them with a part of himself that he could not easily identify as the part most susceptible to manipulation, because that part lived in a region of his inner life, that he experienced not as vulnerability, but as perception, not as the place where he was most easily deceived, but as the place where he saw most clearly. Feanor was by this point the most accomplished craftsman in the history of Middle-earth and a man combined, the person whose hands and mind and will had produced work so far beyond anything that had come before it, that the tradition struggles even to describe it adequately, because adequate description would require a vocabulary of aesthetic achievement that would itself need to be invented for the purpose. He had, in the years of his maturity in Tirion, remade the craft of gemwork entirely, developing techniques that produced stones of a purity and a luminosity that previous work in the same materials could not approach, not because previous craftsmen had been less skilled in the conventional sense, but because Feanor brought to the work a quality of intention so concentrated and so precisely directed that the materials themselves seemed to respond to it differently than they responded to ordinary attention, to become more fully what they were under the pressure of his making, to achieve in the finished work a quality of presence that went beyond what could be explained by the techniques used or the quality of the raw materials alone. The gems he made were alive in some sense that the tradition acknowledges without fully explaining, alive in the way that great art is alive, possessed of an interior quality that makes them feel like expressions of something rather than simply examples of something, as though each stone contained within its facets a specific and irreducible truth about the nature of light and the nature of beauty and the nature of the relationship between the two. The Silmarils were the culmination of everything this capacity had been moving toward across all the years of his work. The 3 jewels that he made from a substance the tradition calls sillimer, a material of his own invention that had no precedent in the history of craft anywhere in the world, a crystalline substance of such extraordinary properties that those who held the Silmarils in their hands described the experience not as holding a stone, but as holding a small portion of living light, a condensed fragment of the illumination of the 2 trees themselves, captured in a form that was stable and permanent and entirely self-contained, requiring no external source to sustain it, carrying within its own substance the light that was its content and its meaning simultaneously. how he made the Sillimer the tradition does not record, and the silence is not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of something that was never fully shared, that remained Feanor's alone even in the accounts that preserve everything else about his work and his life with the thoroughness that the Elvish tradition brought to the recording of important things. The process of making the Silmarils was something he conducted in a privacy so complete that not even his sons, the 7 sons who loved him with the fierce and complicated love that children give to extraordinary parents, not even they were present for the deepest work, the work that produced the Sillimer and poured into it the light that had been captured from the 2 trees and that would outlast the trees themselves and become, after their destruction, the only remaining physical form of the light of Valinor in all the world. The light he captured was the mingled light, the light of the hours between Telperion's brightening and Laurelin's brightening, when the 2 illuminations overlapped and produced the blended radiance that the tradition describes as the most beautiful light in the history of creation. And he took this light, and he poured it into the Sillimer, and he sealed it there with an enchantment so profound and so precisely wrought that the light became not merely contained, but transformed, became something that was both what it had been and something more than what it had been. A light that carried in it the memory of the trees without being simply a reproduction of them, that had in it the warmth of Laurelin and the contemplative depth of Telperion, and also something that was native to the Sillimer itself and to the hands and the will that had shaped it, something that was, in the most precise sense available, Feanor. His specific quality of mind and intention, and the particular form of love for beautiful things that had driven all his work from its earliest beginnings. The Silmarils, when they were completed and lay in Feanor's hands in the workshop in Tirion where he had made them, were objects of such beauty that the tradition reports the Valar themselves coming to look at them, Varda hallowing them so that no evil or mortal hand could touch them without withering, Mandos speaking over them in the deep and prophetic mode that was his particular gift, a statement that the tradition records and that has been meditated upon by Elvish scholars across all the ages since, as one of the most significant and most terrible utterances in the history of the world, that the fate of Arda, the fate of the entire world, was locked within these 3 jewels, that what happened to them would determine what happened to everything, that the light they contained was not merely light but destiny. Not merely beautiful but consequential in a way that the most consequential things in history are always beautiful, inextricably and dangerously beautiful, beautiful in a way that made them irresistible, and their irresistibility made them a weapon in the hands of anyone willing to use the desire for them as an instrument. Melkor desired them with the full force of a desire that had been building across all the long ages of his existence, from the time in the void when he had moved through the emptiness seeking the secret fire of Ilúvatar and had not found it, because what he had been looking for was not a secret fire, but the capacity to make things that were genuinely alive and genuinely new, the capacity that was Ilúvatar's alone, and that Melkor could not possess but only approximate through the corruption and the reworking of what others had made. The Silmarils were the closest thing the world had produced to what Melkor had always wanted, the closest thing to the secret fire made physical and holdable, and capable of being taken. And he looked at them in Feanor's hands and understood, with the clarity of a desire that has finally found its object, that he would have them or he would unmake himself in the attempt. But he was still in Valinor, still nominally under the terms of his release, and the watchful if insufficiently suspicious attention of Manwë, and so what he felt he could not yet do, and what he did instead was to continue the patient work of poisoning, of preparing the conditions under which the jewels would eventually come to him, not through his own direct action, but through the actions of others whose choices he had spent years carefully and invisibly shaping. Feanor, in the meantime, was becoming more difficult. The tradition is honest about this because it was honest about everything that mattered, and what mattered here was that the whispers Melkor had been directing toward him, across the years of his presence in Valinor, had found, in the specific architecture of Feanor's character, exactly the purchase they had been designed to find, had lodged in the places where his genuine grievances and his genuine insecurities, and his genuine perception of the ways in which the world's treatment of his gifts fell short of what those gifts deserved, were concentrated together in a knot of feeling that was too complex and too internal to be easily addressed by the people around him who loved him, and who watched with increasing anxiety as the knot tightened. He became suspicious of his half-brother Fingolfin, who had been born to Finwë's second wife, and who was by any measure a man of extraordinary ability and genuine decency, but who existed in Feanor's increasingly paranoid assessment of his situation as a rival and a threat rather than as a kinsman and a complement. He became possessive of the Silmarils in a way that went beyond any ordinary attachment to a work of great importance, possessive in a way that was indistinguishable from the way that the Silmarils seemed to possess him in return, as though the relationship between the maker and what he had made had become, in this case, bidirectional, as though the light he had poured into them had taken with it something of himself that he could not recover and could not stop trying to protect. He threatened Fingolfin with his sword in the open streets of Tyrion, in an act so extreme and so contrary to everything that the law and the custom of Valinor permitted that it could not be ignored or quietly managed, and the Valar called a council and heard the matter and pronounced a judgment that was as lenient as it could be, while still acknowledging the seriousness of what had occurred, exiling Feanor from Tyrion to the fortress of Formenos in the north of Aman, where he went with his 7 sons and where Finwë, in an act of paternal loyalty that was both deeply moving and deeply consequential, chose to follow him into exile rather than remain in Tyrion without him. And it was at Formenos that Feanor took the Silmarils, and it was at Formenos that Melkor came to visit him, under some pretext of reconciliation or counsel, and it was in that visit that Feanor looked at Melkor and saw, for the first time, and with the clarity of someone whose perception of malice had been sharpened by the experience of being the object of it, exactly what Melkor was and exactly what Melkor wanted, and turned him away from the door with a coldness that was the precise emotional inverse of everything Melkor had been cultivating in him across the years of patient poisoning. He saw through it, at the end, the one time and the last time that seeing through it was still possible, and still without consequence, and he shut the door, and Melkor went away into the darkness of the north, with a hatred of Feanor so pure and so absolute that it was, in its own terrible way, a form of recognition. The recognition that the person you hate most completely is the person who has most completely refused to be what you needed them to be. What came next came from the north, and from below, and it came at the hour of greatest peace, the hour of mingled light, the most beautiful hour in Valinor's cycle, as though what was coming had chosen its moment with the same precise and terrible attention to effect that a craftsman brings to the finishing of a work, as though the destruction of the most beautiful things required the most beautiful possible context in order to achieve its full meaning, its full demonstration of what it was and what it intended, and what nothing in the world was safe from, not even the most luminous and the most protected and the most carefully made things that love and skill had ever produced. She came from the south, from the darkness beyond the walls of the world where she had dwelt since before the world had fully formed itself into the shape it wore in the Age of the Two Trees, and her name was Ungoliant. And the tradition approaches her with the particular care that is reserved for things that resist full comprehension, that exceed the available categories of understanding, and that must therefore be described obliquely, approached through what they do and what they consume, and what remains in the places they have passed through rather than through any direct account of what they are. Because what Ungoliant was at her deepest level was precisely the kind of thing that defies the directness of definition. She was, in the understanding of those elvish scholars who devoted the most serious attention to the question, a spirit of darkness in the most fundamental and most literal sense possible, not merely a being that preferred darkness, or that was associated with darkness by metaphor or by the circumstances of her origin, but something that was constituted by the active consumption of light, that fed on illumination the way living things feed on physical substance, that grew in the presence of light not by being nourished by it in the way that plants are nourished, but by destroying it and drawing into herself the darkness that its destruction produced, becoming larger and more powerful and more completely herself through the annihilation of the thing most opposite to her nature. She had dwelt in the darkness of the far south, in a deep cleft in the mountains at the edge of the world called Avartha, and she had been there for so long that even Melkor, who had been present in the world since the beginning, and whose knowledge of its hidden places was more complete than any other being's, had not been entirely certain of her location or her current state until he went looking for her, which he did with the purposeful attention of someone who has identified a specific tool for a specific purpose, and who needs to locate it before the work can proceed. He went south in the darkness along the western coast of Aman, moving with the concealment that was his oldest and most practiced skill, the skill he had developed in the void and refined across all the long ages of his existence. And he found her in Avathar, and he proposed to her an arrangement that was less a negotiation between equals than an offer from someone who understood the other's appetite and who was in a position to satisfy it in ways that nothing else could. An offer of the greatest feast of light that any light-consuming darkness had ever been in a position to access, in exchange for her help in a task that required her specific and extraordinary gifts. Ungoliant agreed, and together they came north along the western coast of Aman in a darkness of her making, a darkness that was not the ordinary darkness of an unlit place, but something she produced and sustained through her own nature, an unlight, the tradition calls it, a negation of light rather than simply its absence. Thus, a darkness that had in it the quality of active hostility to illumination that made it impenetrable to the ordinary means by which beings of light would have perceived it, so that even the Valar, whose senses operated across ranges far wider than those of the Elvish people, could not see through it, or detect the presences moving within it, could not see Melkor and his terrible companion passing along the edge of their own realm toward the moment that would end the age of the trees and begin the age of grief that followed it. The festival at which the darkness arrived was Erukierme, or something that the tradition describes in terms consistent with the great gathering of the Valar and the Elves together on the slopes of Taniqatil, one of the regular celebrations through which the Blessed Realm expressed its communal joy in the beauty of what it was and what it contained, and on this occasion the celebration had a particular completeness to it. Because the exile of Feanor had recently been mitigated, or was in the process of being mitigated, and there was in Valinor a quality of reconciliation in the air, a tentative return toward the harmony that the troubles of recent years had disturbed, a sense that the long noontide might continue after all, that the tensions that had seemed to threaten it were capable of resolution, and that the light of the two trees would go on brightening and dimming in its beautiful cycles for as long as the world lasted. Most of the Noldor had gone up to Taniqatil for the festival. Formenos in the north was quieter than usual, attended only by Finwë and those who'd remained with him in loyalty to Feanor's exile. Tirion on its hill was largely empty of the people who gave it its life and its warmth. The trees stood in their gardens tended and radiant, the most beautiful and the most vulnerable things in the world, unguarded in any meaningful sense by anything capable of standing against what was coming toward them through the unlight along the western coast. Melkor and Ungoliant came to the trees at the hour of mingled light, and what happened there the tradition records with a brevity that is itself a form of horror, because the brevity is not the brevity of insufficient information, but the brevity of something so terrible that the tradition understood, across all its various versions and all the many Elvish scholars who contributed to the account, that elaboration would be a form of false dramatization, that the reality of the event was larger than any elaboration could contain, and that the attempt to make it vivid through detail would only make it smaller, would reduce it from the category of world historical catastrophe to the category of dramatic scene, which was not the category it belonged to. What happened was this. Melkor struck the trees with his spear, a weapon of his own making that carried in its physical form the concentrated power of all the ages of his hatred and his will, and the blows he struck opened wounds in Telperion and Laurelin, through which the light poured out in streams of silver and gold, and Ungoliant put her mouth to those streams and drank and drank and drank and grew as she drank, to a size and a darkness so enormous that the unlight she produced deepened around her into something that the tradition calls the darkness that can be felt, a quality of negation so complete that those who encountered it in the following hours described the experience not as being in the dark, but as being in something actively opposed to their existence, something that pressed against them with the specific weight of a will that wished them not to be. The light of the two trees went out. Not gradually and not in the way of things that fade because their energy is exhausted, but in the specific manner of things that are killed, with a final brightness before the end, a last brightening that those who were present and who survived the darkness to give account of it described as the most heartbreaking thing they had ever seen, because they did not know in the moment of seeing it that it was the last, that the brightness was the trees spending everything that remained to them in a final luminous effort that could not be sustained, and that ended, as final efforts end, in a darkness more complete than anything that had preceded it, because it was the darkness left behind by something that had been so thoroughly itself in its ending. Telperion's last flower and Laurelin's last fruit were gathered in the darkness that followed, gathered by the Valar with a grief so profound that the tradition describes the gathering as something performed not in the mode of practical action, but in the mode of ritual, of a reverence paid to something whose passing has made the world permanently different from what it was. And these last remains of the tree's light were in time made into the moon, and the sun, the new illuminations of the world that were less than the trees and more than anything Middle-earth had previously known, the diminished but still extraordinary light by which all subsequent history would be conducted, and by which, eventually, human beings would learn to read and to work and to look at one another's faces. But the darkness came first, and in the darkness the second catastrophe of that night occurred, the one that was in some ways more immediately devastating than the destruction of the trees, because the trees were at least things that the Valar could attempt, however unsuccessfully, to heal, while this second catastrophe was irrevocable from the moment of its accomplishment and admitted of no healing at all. Melkor went north, to Formenos, while Ungoliant held the west in darkness, and he went there for the same purpose he had always been moving toward through all the long years of patient preparation, and what he found in Formenos was Finwë, who had stayed while all others had gone up to the festival, and the Silmarils in their strongbox in the treasury, and he killed Finwë, the king of the Noldor, and took the Silmarils, and in doing so committed simultaneously the first killing of an elf by another elf in the history of Arda, which was the desecration of the most fundamental prohibition in the world, and the theft of the most beautiful objects in the world, which were also the objects most deeply connected to the specific nature and the specific grief of the most extraordinary person his people had produced. Feanor received the news of his father's death and the theft of the Silmarils in close succession, and the tradition records his response with the honesty it brought to all the most difficult moments in Elvish history, which is to say that it records a grief so total and so immediate that it was indistinguishable from the thing that grief at that intensity always threatens to become, which is rage, and a rage so pure and so completely possessive of the person it moved through, that it was indistinguishable from the thing that rage at that intensity always threatens to become, which is a consuming fire that burns without discrimination everything within its reach, including the self of the person in whom it burns, and including the people around that person who love them, and who are therefore closest to the heat. He came to Tirion from Formenos with the news of his father's death, and he stood in the square of the city, and he spoke to the Noldor gathered there with all the force and all the gift for language that was his most powerful and most dangerous inheritance, and what he said was what grief and rage say when they are given the voice of a genius, which is to say that it was both entirely untrue in its analysis and entirely compelling in its expression, both a distortion of the situation produced by the specific distortions that his grief and his long preparation by Melkor's whispers had created in his understanding of it, and also an expression of genuine feeling so concentrated and so precisely articulated that the Noldor who heard it understood, perhaps for the first time in the history of their people, what it meant to be moved past the point where analysis and the weighing of alternatives and the careful consideration of consequences are even possible as cognitive operations, what it meant to have the part of the mind that maintains distance from one's own emotional state simply overwhelmed and silenced by the sheer mass of what is being felt. He called Melkor Morgoth, which means in the Sindarin that would later give the name its most widely known form, the Black Foe of the world, and the name was so precisely right, so completely adequate to the reality it named, that it displaced all other names for him immediately and permanently in the understanding of the Elvish people, became the name by which he would be known for all the rest of the ages in which he was a power in the world, because that is what true names do when they are spoken by someone who has the gift for naming, which Feanor had to a degree that no one else in the history of the world possessed in quite the same form. He called for the Noldor to leave Valinor, to go back to Middle-earth and pursue Morgoth and take back the Silmarils and avenge his father's death, and refused to remain in the gilded captivity, as he named it now, of the Blessed Realm, and the Noldor who listened to him felt in the words he spoke the pull of something that was both entirely illegitimate, rooted as it was in grief and rage and the long invisible work of Morgoth's poisoning, and entirely genuine, rooted also in the real qualities of the Noldoran character, the restlessness and the refusal of limitation, and the deep and serious need to be acting in the world rather than preserved from it, to be using their gifts rather than having their gifts used upon them. And then he called upon his 7 sons, and together they swore the oath, and the oath is the thing that the tradition treats with more sustained and more varied and more deeply considered gravity than almost anything else in all of Elvish history, because the oath was the act that more than any other single act determined what the history of the elves in Middle-earth would be, and how it would end and what the cost of its ending would be. The oath was sworn by Feanor and his 7 sons together, by Maedhros and Maglor and Celegorm and Caranthir and Curufin and Amrod and Amrus, all of them sons of the most extraordinary person their people had produced, and all of them possessed, in varying degrees and varying forms, of the qualities that made their father extraordinary, and it was sworn in terms so absolute and so total, and so deliberately stripped of every qualification and every escape clause that the tradition records the moment of its swearing with something that reads as a kind of retrospective horror. The horror of watching people of genuine gifts and genuine worth commit themselves irrevocably to a course whose irrevocability is itself the source of the destruction it will cause. They swore by Ilúvatar and by Manwë and by Vardar, and by the very light of the Silmarils themselves, which was the most terrible part of the swearing, because it made the things they were swearing to recover the instruments of the oath to recover them, folded the jewels into the structure of the oath in a way that made the relationship between the Silmarils and the Sons of Feanor not a relationship of desire or of justice or even of grief, but something more binding and more annihilating than any of those things, a relationship of absolute obligation that would pursue them across all the remaining ages of their lives, and that would, as it pursued them, leave behind it a trail of exactly the destruction it was intended to prevent. They swore to pursue any who held a Silmaril, to take it back by any means available, and from any hand that held it, regardless of who that hand belonged to, regardless of what the taking required, regardless of what alliances or what loves or what innocent lives lay between them and the stone they had bound themselves to reclaim. Elf or man or Vala, or any power under the sky, the oath named them all as enemies if they stood between the Sons of Feanor and a Silmaril, and in naming them as enemies it made enemies of them, made the oath itself a dark and patient power moving through the world, working its terrible logic in situation after situation across centuries of history, extracting the price it was owed from people who had done nothing to incur the debt, and from the Sons of Feanor themselves who had incurred it freely and who found, as those who swear oaths of absolute obligation always find, that the freedom with which they had entered the binding made it no less binding and no less absolute. Mandos, the keeper of the fates of the elves, who spoke rarely, and who chose the moments of his speaking with the precision of someone who understood that the weight of a true statement is partly a function of the context in which it is made, spoke into the silence that followed the swearing of the oath with a statement that the tradition records in its entirety and treats as the most significant prophetic utterance in the history of the Elvish people, which is to say that it treats it as an announcement of something that was already determined rather than as a warning about something that might still be avoided, an account of what the oath had already set in motion rather than a description of consequences that good choices might yet prevent. The doom of Mandos, as it came to be called, spoke of tears unnumbered, of sorrow in ardour, of the Noldor's deeds turning against them and their oaths pursuing them to the world's end, and it spoke of all these things not in the future tense of possibilities, but in the declarative tense of facts, in the register of someone announcing what is rather than warning about what might be. And Feanor heard it and did not unsay the oath, and his sons heard it and did not unsay the oath, and the tradition, which understood why they did not and did not judge them simply for not doing what the grief and the rage of that moment made impossible, records the decision with the full weight of everything it cost, which was everything, which was the whole subsequent history of the Elvish people in Middle-earth, which was the long defeat that Galadriel would name, millennia later, standing at the other end of all the centuries that the oath had spent working its way through the world, and leaving behind it the ruins of everything it touched. The doom of Mandos hung over Tirion in the darkness that followed the swearing of the oath like weather that has not yet broken, present in the air and in the quality of the silence between people who have heard something that cannot be unheard, and who are now navigating the space between what they know and what they have decided to do regardless of what they know, that particular and exhausting space that is defined entirely by the distance between understanding and will. The Noldor who had heard Feanor speak were not fools, and they were not children, and they were not people who had lived so sheltered a life in the blessed realm that they lacked the capacity for the kind of sober assessment that the situation required. They were, as they had always been, among the most intelligent and most perceptive people in the history of the world, and their intelligence and their perception were fully available to them in the days following the oath and the doom, and what those faculties told them was not reassuring and not conducive to the course of action that Feanor was proposing. They knew the distance to Middle-earth. They knew the nature of the enemy they would be pursuing. They knew the terms of the oath that Feanor and his sons had sworn, and they understood, those of them who thought carefully about what those terms implied, that the oath was not merely a commitment to a goal, but a transformation of the people who had sworn it into instruments of a logic that was not their own, a logic that would operate through them with or without their continued consent, and that would not distinguish, in its operation, between the enemies of the Noldor and the friends and kin and innocent strangers who happened to stand in the positions the logic required them to occupy. And yet the host assembled. This is the fact that the tradition sits with for a long time, turning it over and examining it from every available angle, because it is a fact that resists the simple explanations that would make it easier to process, that cannot be fully accounted for by the magnetism of Feanor's personality, or the heat of the moment, or the grief over Finwë's death, or even the long preparation of Morgoth's poisoning, though all of these were real factors and all of them contributed to what happened. The host assembled because the Noldor were genuinely, constitutively, incapable of accepting the alternative, which was to remain in Valinor in the darkness left by the tree's destruction, and to receive from the Valar whatever comfort and whatever new arrangement of the world the Valar chose to provide, to be passive recipients of a situation they had not chosen, rather than active agents in their own history. And the tradition is careful to distinguish between the different groups and the different reasons for their choices, because the departure of the Noldor from Valinor was not a single unified movement, but a complicated sequence of decisions made by different people at different times for different reasons, decisions that were in some cases deliberate and considered, and in others reactive and impulsive, and in still others so constrained by circumstances that the concept of choice barely applies to them in any meaningful sense. Feanor led his own sons and those who had been most completely captured by the force of his speech and the heat of the moment. Behind him, and separately, came a larger host led by Fingolfin, who was not following Feanor in the sense of agreeing with him or endorsing his leadership, but who was following in the sense of refusing to allow the Noldor to be divided, of understanding that if a significant portion of his people were going to Middle-earth regardless of what he decided, the responsible course was to go with them rather than to remain in Valinor, and watch from a safe distance as his people walked into the consequences of a decision he had not been able to prevent. Finarfin, the youngest of Finwë's sons, led a third contingent, smaller than the others, and already, even before the journey had properly begun, marked by the quality of reluctance and grief that would eventually, in his case, reach the threshold at which reluctance becomes refusal. They went north, through the darkness, following the coast of Aman toward the narrow place in the far north, where Middle-earth and Aman came closest to one another, and where the sea was most crossable, or least uncrossable, which was a different thing in a world in which the sea between the Undying Lands and the mortal world was not merely a physical expanse of water, but a boundary with the full weight of the Valar's intention behind it, a boundary that was designed not to be easily crossed, and that resisted crossing in ways that were both practical and something deeper than practical, something that operated at the level of the world's own understanding of what was proper and what was not. They walked through the darkness in a host of such size that the tradition compares the sound of their movement to the sound of a great army, the tramp of feet and the murmur of voices and the particular quality of noise that a large number of people moving together through a dark landscape produces, purposeful and unsettled simultaneously, determined and afraid in equal measure, carrying with them everything they had decided to carry from the lives they were leaving and leaving behind, in the darkness of Valinor under the vanished light of the trees, everything they had decided not to carry, which included most of the life they had actually built there across all the long years of the noontide. They came to Alqualonde, the haven of the Teleri, the city of the swan ships at the northern edge of the inhabited regions of Aman. And Feanor asked the Teleri for their ships. He asked as someone who understood that he was asking for the most precious things the Teleri possessed. The ships they had built over long ages of patient and loving craft. The ships that were to the Teleri what the Silmarils were to Feanor himself. Not merely valuable objects, but expressions of their deepest nature, the physical form of everything most central to who they were as a people. He asked, and the Teleri refused, and the refusal was not unreasonable, was in fact as reasonable as any refusal in the entire history of Elvish decision-making, rooted as it was in both the genuine value of what was being asked for and the legitimate doubts about the wisdom of the enterprise that the Teleri, who'd heard the doom of Mandos and who were not subject to the same forces that had swept the Noldor past the point of sober assessment, were entirely capable of maintaining. They offered alternatives. They offered to sail the Noldor themselves, to be the mariners for the crossing. They offered counsel and the consideration of delay. What they did not offer was the ships themselves, and Feanor, whose capacity for accepting refusals had been entirely consumed by the grief and the rage and the absolute imperative of the oath, heard the refusal as a betrayal and responded to the betrayal as someone responds who has nothing left that functions as a brake on the expression of what they feel. What happened in Alqualondë is called in the tradition the first kinslaying, and the word kinslaying carries in it everything that needs to be said about the category of the event, which is the category of the worst things that can happen, the things that violate the most fundamental prohibitions and that leave behind them a residue of guilt and grief so concentrated and so permanent that it alters the essential character of everyone involved in it. Not merely those who acted, but those who were present and those who came after and inherited the knowledge of what had been done in their name or with their acquiescence, or simply in a time and a place that was their time and their place. Elves killed elves. This had happened once before at Formenos when Morgoth killed Finwë, but that killing, terrible as it was, had a clarity about it, a clear perpetrator and a clear victim and a clear quality of external violation, of something done to the Elvish people from outside. What happened at Alqualondë was done by the Elvish people to themselves, by Noldor to Teleri, by the people of the greatest craftsmen in the world to the people of the greatest mariners, in the haven of swan-shaped ships that the moonless darkness made into shapes of pure shadow, and the tradition records it with the restraint that it brought to all the most terrible moments in the history it was preserving. The restraint of understanding that to elaborate is to aestheticize, and to aestheticize is to falsify, and to falsify is to do a second wrong to people who have already been wronged as completely as people can be wronged. The Noldor of Fingolfin's host arrived at Alqualondë after the fighting had begun, some of them, and the tradition is honest about the ambiguity of their involvement, acknowledging that some of them took part in the fighting under the confused impression that the Teleri had attacked first, that the situation they arrived into was already too chaotic and too dark and too loud, with the sounds of violence to permit the kind of assessment that would have told them clearly what was happening and allowed them to refuse participation with the full consciousness of what they were refusing. The tradition does not excuse this. It understands it, which is different and in some ways more difficult, because understanding requires the acknowledgement of how completely circumstances can constrain the choices that are theoretically available to people in them, while still maintaining that the constraint was not absolute, that choices were made, that the making of those choices had consequences that were real and permanent, regardless of the confusion in which they were made. The ships were taken, and the host continued north, and the darkness continued around them, and Finarfin, who had been among the most reluctant from the beginning, reached a point somewhere in the cold country between Alqualondë and the Helcaraxë, where the weight of what had happened in the haven of the Teleri became heavier than the weight of everything that had been pulling him forward, and he stopped, and he turned, and he went back to Valinor, and the tradition records his turning without condemnation, and without the kind of retrospective approval that the knowledge of what happened to those who continued might seem to warrant, because the turning was an honest response to an honest assessment of what had occurred and what it meant. And honest responses to honest assessments deserve to be recorded as what they are rather than as lessons or as examples or as anything other than the choices of a specific person in a specific moment who looked at the situation with clear eyes and did what he understood to be the right thing regardless of the cost. He wept, the tradition says, and the tears were for his father and for the Teleri dead in Alqualondë, and for his people dividing themselves in the darkness of a world whose light had been put out. And then he went back, and became in time the king of those Noldor who remained in Valinor, and built with them a life that was diminished by the grief of what had been lost, and dignified by the honesty of what had been chosen. The rest continued north to Ahriman, to the cold and empty coast opposite the Helcaraxë, the grinding ice that was the northernmost connection between Aman and Middle-earth, a bridge of ice so treacherous and so vast and so completely hostile to the passage of living beings that the tradition describes it in terms that make it read less like a geographical feature, and more like a manifestation of the world's own judgment on what was attempting to cross it. A landscape of pressure ridges and crevasses and wind so cold it was not merely cold, but something more specific than cold. The specific cold of a place that has never been warm and that does not understand warmth as a condition it is capable of containing. The cold of absolute indifference expressed in physical form. Between Araman and the Helcarax there was also the sea, the narrow sea of the north, and on that sea Feanor's ships rode at anchor, the ships taken from Alqualonde. The ships that were the only practical means of crossing to Middle-earth without enduring the grinding ice. The ships that Feanor now controlled, and that were insufficient in number to carry the entire host in a single crossing. Feanor crossed first with his sons and his people, and a portion of Fingolfin's people, and those who crossed first came to the eastern shore of the sea in the darkness before dawn, and stood on the soil of Middle-earth for the first time and felt, the tradition says, something that was not what any of them had expected to feel, something more complex and more quiet than the exaltation that the speeches in Tyrion had seemed to promise, something that had in it the specific quality of a feeling that occurs when you have arrived at a destination you have been moving toward with great urgency and great sacrifice, and you find, in the moment of arrival, that the urgency and the sacrifice are still present in you and that the arrival has not resolved them. That you're still the person who has done the things you have done, and that the destination does not change what you are but only what is around you. They stood on the shore of Middle-earth and looked back at the sea and waited for the ships to return. The ships did not return. Feanor made the decision at the eastern shore, in council with his sons and with those among his people who were closest to him and most completely committed to the course he was pursuing, and the tradition records the decision and the council that preceded it with an economy that reflects, perhaps, something of the economy with which the decision itself was reached, or perhaps reflects only the fact that the tradition's sympathies in this moment are entirely and uncomplicatedly with those who were left behind on the western shore, who stood in the darkness of Araman and watched the horizon, and waited for the ships that Feanor had decided not to send back. He burned them on the eastern shore, the ships of Alqualonde, the swan-shaped ships of pearl and white timber that the Teleri had built across all the long years of their dwelling in the haven. The most beautiful ships in the history of the world and the most painfully acquired, and the fire of their burning was visible from the western shore of the narrow sea, visible to Fingolfin's host waiting in the cold of Araman. The first fire in the sky over Middle-earth, in the age after the trees, a fire made from ships made from the labour of a people they had killed to take them. Fingolfin stood on the shore of Araman in the firelight of the burning ships, and understood what had happened, and the tradition records his response with a brevity that is its own eloquence, saying only that he looked north toward the Helcaraxi, and that he led his people onto the grinding ice. What this meant in practical terms is something that the tradition elaborates across the accounts of those who survived the crossing, and who spent the rest of their very long lives carrying the memory of what the Helcaraxi was, and what it asked of the people who crossed it. A crossing that took a period of time, the tradition does not precisely specify, but that was long enough to kill some of those who attempted it, and to leave in all the survivors a quality of experience so extreme and so formative that it became one of the defining facts of the Noldoran character as it expressed itself in Beleriand, the fact of the ice always present in the people who had crossed it. The cold of the Helcarax carried in the body alongside the warmth of everything they had been before it, and everything they were trying to build after it. They crossed the grinding ice in the darkness, Fingolfin's host, in the period before the first sunrise, before the moon had been made and set in the sky, in the oldest and most complete darkness that the world had yet produced, after the trees were dead and before the new lights had been kindled, and they came to Middle-earth cold and diminished and entirely committed, their turning back made impossible by what lay behind them, and their going forward made necessary by what they were. The sun rose for the first time as they stepped onto the shores of Middle-earth. The tradition records, and the timing is so precisely meaningful, that scholars have debated across centuries whether it is historical fact, or the kind of symbolic truth that traditions sometimes express in the form of historical fact, because the symbolic truth is so completely real that it earns the register of the historical, the register of things that actually happened. The first sunrise over Middle-earth illuminated Fingolfin's host on the northern shore. Exhausted and grief-laden and cold in a way that went deeper than their bodies, and it illuminated them in a light that was the light of Laurelyn's last fruit made into the vessel of the sun, the last light of Valinor made into the first light of the New Age, as though the world itself was acknowledging what they had done, and what they had survived, and what they were committed to, as though the light was specifically for them, a recognition from the universe of people who had earned, through the crossing of the grinding ice in absolute darkness, the right to be illuminated. You have walked a long road tonight, through the darkness before the first sunrise and the light that came after it, through the music that was sung before the world existed, and the shore where the first eyes opened onto starlight and cold water, through the forests where something hunted, and the long westward road where a people became several peoples, and each of those peoples became, through the specific weight of their choices and their losses and their loves, entirely and irreversibly themselves. You have sat with grief that was older than the sun, and with beauty that was made in full knowledge of its own fragility, with the understanding that the most luminous things in the history of this world were luminous specifically because they were vulnerable, because the light they contained was held in forms that could be broken, and in people who could be lost, and in friendships that the pressure of impossible choices could fracture beyond repair. This is what the elves knew, and what they carried, and what they sang about in all their long ages of dwelling in the world and watching it change around them. Let that singing be the last sound in your mind tonight. Let the starlight find the water. Let the world be new again, and still, and full of things not yet named. The long road is done for now. Sleep, and let the stars keep watch.